She was abandoned at the most expensive table in Chicago on Christmas Eve, and the most dangerous man in the city watched every second of it. Emma Clark didn't cry. She wanted to. God, she wanted to fall apart right there beneath those crystal chandeliers while the whole restaurant pretended not to stare. But she held it together with shaking hands, wrapped around a glass of water she couldn't afford, in a dress she'd borrowed from her roommate, in a world that had never once made room for her. Then the air changed. Conversations dropped. Waiters froze. And a voice came from directly behind her, low, unhurried, carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to raise itself to be obeyed. That seat looks like it's been wasted on the wrong person all evening. If you're watching this story until the very end, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The reservation had been Derek's idea. That should have been Emma's first warning sign. A man who suggested Maison Laurent for a first blind date was either genuinely wealthy or desperately performing wealth, and in Emma's limited but hard-earned experience, the second category was far more dangerous than the first. She told herself it didn't matter. Her friend Julie had set them up with the kind of breathless, over-caffeinated energy that made Emma feel guilty saying no. He's a banker, Emma, like a real one. Private wealth management. He went to Northwestern, as if Northwestern was a personality trait. As if a good university wiped away whatever else a man might be. She'd borrowed Sarah's black dress, the one with the modest neckline and the hem that hit just below the knee, conservative enough to signal she wasn't trying too hard, fitted enough to signal she'd tried, at least a little. She'd spent 45 minutes on her hair in the cramped bathroom of the apartment she shared with two other women, both of whom worked the same restaurant circuit she did, all three of them orbiting the same gravitational pull of tips and rent and the constant, exhausting arithmetic of staying afloat. The cab to Maison Laurent had cost her $16 she didn't have. She arrived 7 minutes early because Emma Clark was always early to things that mattered to her, and this had mattered to her even though she wouldn't have admitted that to anyone. She'd wanted it to go well. She'd wanted to sit across from someone who looked at her like she was worth looking at, who asked questions and actually waited for the answers, who made her feel like less of a ghost moving through a city that had never quite noticed she existed. The maitre d' had seated her at the table Derek reserved, a corner booth draped in white linen, lit by a small candelabra, overlooking the snow-dusted street outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the kind of table that made you feel important. Emma had sat down, smoothed the borrowed dress over her knees, and ordered the water. Derek arrived 14 minutes late. He was handsome in the way that expensive, mediocre men often are. Strong jaw, good haircut, a watch that probably cost more than Emma's monthly rent. He shook her hand instead of saying hello, which told her almost everything she needed to know about him in the first 3 seconds, but she smiled anyway because she was trying. He ordered a bottle of wine without asking if she drank. She did, but that wasn't the point, and launched immediately into a monologue about his recent promotion that lasted through the bread service, the appetizers, and most of the entrees. Emma ate her food and asked questions she didn't care about, and nodded at the right intervals and thought, this is fine. This is how it goes. You sit through one bad dinner, and then you go home and you eat cereal and watch television, and you try again in 6 months when Julie has another candidate. Then his phone rang. He glanced at it and something shifted in his face. A flicker of something eager and calculating, the mask dropping for just a second. He stood up from the table without fully meeting her eyes. I have to take this, he said. Work thing, sorry. He walked toward the bar, phone pressed to his ear, already smiling at whatever was on the other end of the line. Emma waited. She watched the candelabra burn. She watched the snow fall beyond the window, fat and slow. The kind of snow that made Chicago look like a postcard instead of the cold, indifferent machine it actually was. She watched the other diners, couples leaning toward each other, families mid-argument about who was driving home, a woman at the bar laughing too loudly at something a man in a gray suit had said. After 20 minutes, she checked her phone. Derek had texted. Something came up. Sorry. Tonight isn't going to work. Happy holidays. Emma stared at the message for a long time, long enough that a waiter approached her table with the careful, apologetic tread of someone who already suspected what had happened. Can I get you anything else, miss? She looked up, smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. Just the check, please. The check came to $243. Emma's share of the food, the appetizer and the entree she'd ordered while carefully staying in the mid-range of the menu so she wouldn't seem presumptuous, came to $58. But the bottle of wine Derek had ordered and half consumed before abandoning her pushed the total into territory that made her stomach drop. She did the math. She had $60 in her checking account and 11 days until her next paycheck from the restaurant where she worked lunch shifts. She sat with the check on the table in front of her and breathed carefully through her nose and absolutely did not cry, because she had learned a long time ago that crying in public was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not here. Not in front of crystal chandeliers and linen tablecloths and strangers who would look through her while pretending to look away. She reached for the clutch she'd borrowed along with the dress, because of course she'd borrowed the clutch too, and was calculating whether her debit card would simply decline outright or whether she'd be left with a humiliating partial payment conversation when the atmosphere in the room changed so completely and so suddenly that it took her a moment to understand what she was feeling. It started at the door. The maitre d' didn't just straighten. He transformed, his entire posture reconfiguring from professional courtesy to something closer to controlled alarm. The two waiters nearest the entrance moved simultaneously without appearing to coordinate it. A man in a black suit who had been standing near the coat check with no apparent purpose revealed his actual purpose by shifting his jacket slightly, the movement careful and practiced, creating access to something beneath the fabric. Then another, and another. 4 men total, positioned at the corners of the room like pieces on a board, all of them oriented toward the entrance with the focused attention of professionals who were paid to be ready for violence. The conversations in the room didn't stop all at once. They dissolved, table by table, rippling outward from the entrance in a wave of sudden silence that moved through the restaurant like a pressure change. The woman at the bar stopped laughing. The family stopped arguing. The couple leaning toward each other pulled back instinctively, some animal part of their brains registering a threat before their conscious minds caught up. Emma didn't turn around. She didn't know why she didn't turn around. Some instinct told her that turning around quickly was the wrong thing to do, that there was something happening behind her that required stillness. Her hands were flat on the table. Her breathing had slowed. She could feel the presence before she could identify it. A weight in the air, a gravitational shift, the sense that something had entered the room that was fundamentally different in kind from everything else in it. She heard footsteps. Measured, unhurried, moving through the silence without appearing to care about it. And then the voice. That seat looks like it's been wasted on the wrong person all evening. Low, smooth, Russian accent beneath the precision of it, just enough to give the words a particular texture. The kind of voice that had learned to be quiet because it had never needed to be loud. Emma felt it in her sternum before she processed the words. She turned her head slowly. The man standing behind her to her left was perhaps 32 or 33, though something in his eyes made the number feel irrelevant. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than a gym membership. Dark hair, cut short, a jaw that had been broken at some point in the past and had healed slightly imperfect, which somehow made his face more striking rather than less. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who are used to having expensive things, effortlessly and without performance. But it was his eyes that made Emma's breath catch. Ice blue. The specific color of glaciers in photographs. Blue so pale it looked almost silver in certain light, set beneath dark brows, framed by lashes that were too long for a face this sharp. Those eyes were looking at her with an attention so complete and undivided that it felt physically different from being looked at by anyone she'd ever met. Not desire, exactly. Not yet. Something more fundamental. The look of someone encountering a thing that interests them, studying it without apology, deciding what it means. "You're welcome to continue staring at the door," he said. Or, he pulled out the chair across from her, the chair Derek had occupied, with one hand, the motion fluid and unhurried. "You could have dinner with someone who will actually be here when you finish eating." Emma looked at him. She looked at the men positioned around the room. She looked at the check on the table in front of her. Then she looked back at him. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. He sat down. "But you know the man who just left you with his wine bill? That seems like a useful comparison." Something about the directness of it, The complete absence of performance or flattery caught Emma off guard. She'd expected some variation of a line, something polished and practiced. This was neither. This was a man stating an observation as plainly as he would state the weather. "Emma Clark," she said, because she didn't know what else to do. "Dmitry Volkov." He signaled a waiter with 2 fingers, and the nearest server appeared at the table with the speed of someone who had been waiting to be summoned. "Take the check, and bring whatever she was going to order for dessert." He glanced at Emma. "What were you going to order?" "I wasn't going to order dessert." "What would you have ordered if the night had gone the way it was supposed to?" The question was strange, too specific, too perceptive. Emma looked at the menu she'd already memorized twice during the 20 minutes she'd spent waiting for Derek to return. "The chocolate fondant," she said, before she'd made a conscious decision to answer. Dmitry looked at the waiter. 2. The waiter vanished. Emma watched him go and then looked back at the man across the table. There were approximately 12 things she should be doing instead of sitting here, and she knew all of them. She should be excusing herself. She should be calling a cab. She should be going home to her borrowed dress and her shared apartment and her 11 days until payday, putting this whole disastrous evening behind her with the grim efficiency she'd developed for handling setbacks. She stayed. "You're not concerned," she said, "that a woman you've never met might take offense at you sitting down without asking." "I asked," he said, "after you sat." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "If you'd wanted me to leave, you would have said so immediately." He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it, and Emma found that more unsettling than if he'd been wrong. She was trying to find the angle, the play, the routine, the thing this was actually about, because men like this, men who moved through rooms with armed guards and unhurried authority, did not sit down across from struggling waitresses at the end of failed blind dates out of simple human kindness. Nothing was simple. Nothing was free. "What do you want?" she asked. Dmitry looked at her steadily. "I want to have dessert," he said, and possibly an answer to a question that's more complicated than it sounds, but that can wait until after the fondant. The fondant arrived in less than 3 minutes, which told Emma a great deal about how quickly this kitchen could move when properly motivated. It was perfect. Dark, slightly bitter chocolate with a center that broke open at the first touch of a spoon, releasing something warm and almost unbearably good. Emma ate it and hated how much she enjoyed it, and noticed that Dmitry ate his with the focus of someone who took sensory pleasure seriously, without performing it. "Your question," she said when she'd finished. He set down his spoon. Those glacier eyes settled on her face with the same undivided attention as before, and Emma had the strange and uncomfortable sensation of being genuinely, thoroughly seen. Not in the way men usually looked at her, which was either through her or at the surface of her, but something more careful and complete, like he was reading something. "I need a wife," he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Emma put down her own spoon with a small, deliberate click. "I'm sorry?" "A wife. Specifically, a real marriage. License, public record, social presence. Someone who can be introduced to certain people in certain settings and hold the position convincingly." He paused. "Before you call this insane, which it is, let me explain the exchange." "The exchange?" Emma repeated. "You're working shifts at a restaurant that pays you $11 an hour plus tips on a good day. You have approximately—" He glanced at the clutch on the table with the brief focus of someone doing rapid calculation. "Less than $100 in your account right now. You borrowed both the dress and the bag, and you were sitting here calculating whether your debit card would decline before I sat down." Emma's entire body went cold and still. "How could you possibly—" "I've been watching this table since before you arrived," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a threat. It was simply a fact, stated with the same flat directness as everything else he'd said. And I am very good at reading people. She should have stood up. Every rational part of her brain, and Emma Clark was, under normal circumstances, a deeply rational person, was issuing clear instructions. Stand up, walk to the door, go home. She felt the instructions and did not move. "What does the exchange look like?" she asked. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "You become Emma Volkov. Publicly, completely, convincingly. You move into my residence. You attend events when required, meet specific people, maintain the social reality of a marriage. In exchange, he reached into his interior jacket pocket and placed a card on the table between them. A plain white card with a number handwritten on it in black ink. This amount, deposited into an account in your name the morning after we sign, plus full coverage of all personal expenses for the duration. Emma looked at the number on the card. She looked at it for a long time. It was more money than she would earn in 6 years of lunch shifts. Why, she said carefully, does the most feared... She stopped. Dimitri's expression didn't change. You know who I am. I recognized your name, she said. I've worked in Chicago restaurants for 4 years, the staff talks. She held his gaze. Why does a man like you need a marriage of convenience? You have 40 people in this room who would do anything you asked. Because what I need is not obedience, he said. I need someone who doesn't already know how to perform this particular role. Someone whose reactions will be genuine, whose history is clean, who can't be compromised by anyone who already has access to my world. He paused. And because I watched a man abandon you tonight in the middle of dinner and you didn't fall apart, you sat here and you did your math and you held it together and you didn't beg anyone for anything. That is a specific kind of strength that is very difficult to find. Emma looked at him across the white linen table with the snow falling outside and the armed guards positioned at the edges of her peripheral vision and the number on the white card between them. And she thought about the $60 in her checking account, and the 11 days until payday, and the borrowed dress and the cab home that she was already dreading, and the apartment where Sarah would ask how the date went with the brittle hopefulness of someone who needed good news almost as badly as Emma did. I need to think about it, she said. Of course. He stood, buttoning his jacket with the same unhurried efficiency as everything else he did. He left a card on the table, a second one, this one with a phone number. You have 48 hours. After that, I'll need to find another solution. He turned to leave. Volkov. The name came out of her mouth before she'd decided to say it. He paused, turned back. Those eyes found her face immediately, without searching for it. The guards, she said, the ones positioned around the room, are they yours or are they here because someone is trying to kill you? Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, the look of someone revising an estimate upward. Both, he said. Those two things are not mutually exclusive in my life. Then he walked out through the restaurant while the armed men peeled away from their positions and followed him like shadows. And Emma sat alone again at the white linen table with 2 empty dessert plates and a phone number, and a number on a card that could change her entire life. And the snow fell outside the window onto the empty Christmas Eve streets of Chicago, and she thought, I should go home. She didn't go home for another hour. She sat and drank the rest of her water and watched the snow, and thought about every version of the next 48 hours and what each of them meant. And when she finally left, the maitre d' held the door for her with a degree of deference that had not been present when she arrived. And she understood that something had already changed even though she hadn't agreed to anything yet. The cab home cost $16. She had the exact change. She tipped the driver $3 she couldn't afford. She didn't sleep that night. The apartment was quiet. Sarah and Mia both out at various holiday gatherings. Emma had declined, citing the date, which now felt like a joke with no punchline. She sat on her bed in the borrowed dress because she hadn't bothered to change, and she looked at the card with the phone number, and she looked at the card with the number, and she thought about Dmitry Volkov's ice blue eyes, and the way he'd said, I need a wife, with the same intonation most people used to say, I need a cab. She did what she always did when she needed to think. She made a list, not on paper. In her head, the way she'd been making lists since she was 12 years old and her mother was cycling through one of her bad periods, and someone needed to keep track of which bills were due and which could wait another week. Mental architecture. Ordered columns. The discipline of staying rational when everything around you was asking you to panic. Column 1. The reasons this was insane. The man was a criminal. Not white collar, not technically a gray area. A genuine organized crime figure with a level of notoriety that meant his name was said quietly in Chicago restaurants 4 years after Emma had started working in them. The men with guns had been real. The weight of the danger in that room had been real. If she stepped into his world, she would be stepping into something from which clean exits were not guaranteed. Column 2. The reasons she was still thinking about it. The number on the card. The way he'd looked at her. Not through her, not at the surface of her, but at something actual. The observation he'd made about her strength, stated without flattery, without the manipulative warmth men sometimes use to lower a woman's defenses. He'd said it like he was noting a fact, the fact that he'd asked her instead of someone who already knew how to perform the role, which meant, on some level, he'd chosen her. Not randomly, deliberately. She fell asleep just after 3 in the morning with the card still in her hand and woke up 6 hours later to a text from Julie asking how the date went and Sarah's voice in the kitchen asking the same question at higher volume. And Emma lay in bed for a moment looking at the ceiling, and then she picked up her phone and opened a browser and typed in the name she already knew. She spent 3 hours reading. She read everything that was publicly available about Dmitry Volkov, which was not nothing. The FBI maintained what appeared to be a permanent interest in his activities, though no charges had ever survived a trial. Witnesses recanting, evidence disappearing, prosecutorial strategies collapsing at inconvenient moments. He had been photographed at charity galas, political fundraisers, restaurant openings. In photographs, he wore his wealth lightly and held himself with the straight-backed self-possession of someone who had never needed to make himself smaller in anyone else's presence. He had not been photographed with a woman in 3 years. Emma thought about that for a long time. She thought about what it meant to be alone at that specific altitude, the kind of alone where power insulated you from connection, where the people around you were too afraid or too calculating to approach anything real. She'd been alone in a different way, the invisible kind, the kind where you moved through crowded rooms and nobody's eyes stopped on you. 2 different species of the same basic condition. She picked up the phone. He answered on the second ring. "You have 36 hours remaining," he said, which told her he'd saved her number. "I have questions," she said. "Come to the address I'll send you. Tonight, 8 o'clock. A pause. "I'll send a car." "I don't need a car." "The address is in a neighborhood where you'll want a car," he said. Not a threat, just geography. "I'll send it at 7:45. He sent the car at 7:40. The building was on the North Shore, not a neighborhood Emma knew well, which was the point, she suspected. The kind of address that didn't appear on ordinary maps of the city's social geography. A tower of glass and dark steel set back from the lakefront. The kind of architecture that communicated security without announcing it. The kind of building where the lobby staff had probably been background checked more thoroughly than most federal employees. The car, a black SUV with tinted windows and a driver who offered her name without being asked and confirmed it was her before opening the door, took her through 40 minutes of Christmas Eve traffic to the building's private entrance, where a man who was definitely not a doorman in any conventional sense held open a door and guided her to a private elevator that opened directly into a space that stopped her breathing for a moment. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, the entire skyline of Chicago spread out below like a map of a world she'd been living in without access to this particular view. The lake was a vast dark expanse beyond the lights, the snow coming down over it all, the city burning below the clouds. It was the most beautiful thing Emma Clark had seen in her adult life, and she hated that her first response was to price it mentally and find the number incomprehensible. Dmitry was standing at the far window with a glass in his hand that she would later learn contained vodka and nothing else, the way he always drank it. He was in a different suit, black this time, no tie, the collar button open. He turned when she came in. "You read about me," he said. "Yes." "And you came anyway." "I have questions," she said again. "Answers first, decision after." He gestured toward the seating area. Long, low furniture and dark leather, a coffee table with a file on it, a view of the world 40 stories below. She sat. He sat across from her, set. The same distance as the restaurant table had been, the same posture. Forward, focused, economical. "Ask," he said. "What are you afraid of?" she said. He looked at her without expression for a moment. "That's not the question I expected." "I know. Answer it anyway." A long pause. His thumb moved against the glass in his hand, a small, unconscious motion. "My father built this organization from nothing," he said finally. "When he died, I was 24. I took it over when every man in it was 30 years older than me and thought I'd be manageable." He looked at the window, at the city. "I spent 8 years making sure they understood I wasn't. Now I have enemies who are not afraid of me the way they should be, because they've started to believe that I've gone soft, that I've spent enough time building legitimate businesses and attending legitimate events that the thing underneath has gotten smaller. And has it? Emma asked. His eyes came back to her. No. The word was quiet and completely final, and Emma believed it without question. Viktor Koslov, she said. She'd found the name in her reading, a Russian name connected to a rival syndicate operating out of New York, currently expanding westward. He's what you're protecting against. Among others, but yes, primarily. He set down his glass. Koslov believes I'm isolated, that there's nothing personal in my life that can be used against me, but also nothing that stabilizes my alliances with the families that expect a certain kind of structure in the men they do business with. A wife changes the calculation on both sides. It signals permanence. It signals that there's something worth protecting, which reads differently than fear. It signals that you're vulnerable, Emma said. Yes, he said it without any attempt to soften it. But vulnerability, strategically placed, is a different kind of strength. It says I have something worth fighting for, which says I will fight. Emma looked at him. She thought about strategy and fear and the specific kind of math that powerful men did when they were trying to survive, and she recognized the structure of it. She'd been doing a smaller version of the same calculation for her entire life. What happens when it ends, she said. When the threat is neutralized, whenever that is. What happens to me? You walk away with what was agreed, you resume your life. And if something happens to you before that? He looked at her with what might have been approval. There is a document being prepared. If I'm killed during the term of the arrangement, you receive double the agreed amount, transferred immediately from a separate account that exists precisely for that contingency. Emma breathed. You've thought about this. I think about most things. She looked at the city below them. She thought about Sarah and Mia and the apartment and the lunch shifts and the $16 cab rides and the borrowed dresses and the man who had abandoned her at a restaurant table on Christmas Eve without enough basic decency to deliver the news in person. She thought about Dmitry Volkov telling her she had a specific kind of strength that was difficult to find. She thought about what it would feel like to stop doing the arithmetic of staying afloat for long enough to breathe. I have conditions, she said. Tell me. I keep working. She watched his face. Not the restaurant job? I don't need the income. But I'm in a program. Nights and weekends, hospitality management. I have 1 year left. Whatever this arrangement requires, it doesn't interfere with my program. Agreed. I have my own space in whatever residence is involved. Private. A room that's mine. There are 4 bedrooms. Take 2. Emma almost smiled. And I need to be able to contact a person outside of this situation. One person who knows broadly what's happening, not details. Just enough that if something happens to me, someone who isn't connected to you knows to ask questions. He looked at her for a moment. That is the most intelligent condition anyone has ever negotiated with me. Agreed? She said. Agreed. He held out his hand. We have a deal, Emma Clark. She looked at the hand, the scarred knuckles, the steadiness of it, extended across the coffee table between them with the same directness that characterized everything he'd done in the past 24 hours. Emma Clark, who had been invisible for so much of her life, who had been abandoned at a restaurant table on Christmas Eve, who had done the arithmetic of staying afloat so many times it had become the background music of her existence, looked at the hand of the most dangerous man she had ever met. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief, and when he let go, she could feel the warmth of it for a moment afterward, and she told herself that didn't mean anything. You'll move in the day after tomorrow, he said. That's fast. Fast is safer. He stood, picked up his glass. I'll have someone contact you in the morning with the details. Tonight, my driver will take you home. Emma stood as well. She smoothed the borrowed dress, the same one as last night she hadn't thought to change before coming, and looked at the city one more time, this impossible panorama of light and snow and distance, the world she'd been living inside without ever seeing it from this altitude. Volkov, she said. He looked at her. If you lie to me about anything, she said, about the terms, about the danger, about any part of what this is, I will leave. No negotiation, just gone. She met those glacier eyes without flinching. Are we clear? The pause that followed was 2 seconds long, and in those 2 seconds, Emma had the absolute irrational certainty that no one had spoken to Dmitry Volkov this way in a very long time. "We're clear," he said. She went home. She told Sarah she'd gotten a job offer, which was technically true, and started packing. She had 36 hours before she moved into the penthouse of the most feared man in Chicago. She spent all of them wondering what she'd just agreed to, and whether the warmth she'd felt from his handshake would still be there in the morning. It was. That was the part she was most afraid of. The morning she moved in, she found a note on the kitchen counter of the penthouse in handwriting she was seeing for the first time. Angular, precise. The letters slightly compressed, the writing of someone who'd been taught formal penmanship and had spent decades making it efficient. The refrigerator is stocked. The east bedroom has the better view. There is a car available to you at all times. Ask Marcus at the desk. Tonight, 7 p.m., we have dinner with two men whose opinion of this arrangement will determine the next 3 months. Dress like you belong here. D.V. Emma read it twice. She put it down. She opened the refrigerator and looked at its contents. Stocked was an understatement. And then she looked out the east window at the lake and the city, and the snow still falling over all of it, thinner now, the sky pale and cold and enormous. She thought, I belong here as much as I've ever belonged anywhere. She got dressed. She put on the clothes that had been hanging in the east bedroom closet, her size exactly, which meant someone had done research she wasn't entirely comfortable with, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and didn't entirely recognize the woman looking back. She had 6 hours before dinner. In 4 of them, she was going to learn things about Dmitry Volkov that would make leaving feel impossible. In the 6th, she was going to see something that would make her wonder if she'd made the most dangerous mistake of her life. The dinner was at 7, and by 5:15, Emma had already changed clothes 3 times. Not because she was vain, she'd never had enough clothes to be vain about. She was standing in front of the closet in the east bedroom, the one with the better view, the one Dmitry's note had recommended, which she'd chosen partly because of the view and partly because she refused to feel managed. And she was doing the calculation she always did when she needed to walk into a room and hold a position. What does the room expect? What does the room fear? Which version of you do you send in first? The clothes in the closet were all new, tags removed, but the stiffness of unworn fabric still present in the seams. Someone had bought them in her size and her approximate taste, or rather, in an approximation of her taste elevated about 3 income brackets. Dark colors, clean lines, nothing that required performance to wear. She pulled out a deep burgundy dress that hit mid-calf, structured at the shoulder, with a neckline that was present without being aggressive. She put it on and looked in the mirror and stood there for a moment with her own face. Dress like you belong here. She thought about the first time she'd walked into a restaurant kitchen at 19 and the head chef had looked at her like she was furniture that had arrived in the wrong room. She'd gone back every morning for 2 weeks until he stopped looking at her like that. Not because he'd decided she belonged, because she'd stopped giving him the option of deciding. Same principle, different room. She put on the earrings that were sitting on the bathroom counter. Simple gold, not flashy, the kind of thing a woman wore when she wanted to look composed rather than trying, and went to find Dmitry. He was in the main room, standing at the window again, but this time he was on the phone, and his posture was different from the still considered quality she'd seen the previous 2 nights. His shoulders were set. His free hand was moving slightly at his side. Not a gesture, more like a pressure release, the motion of a man holding himself back from something. He was speaking in Russian, rapid and low, and Emma could not understand a word of it, but she could read the tenor of it without difficulty. He was furious. Not the theatrical fury of men who needed witnesses, the cold, contained kind, the kind that went all the way down. She stood in the doorway and waited. He ended the call without a closing word, turned, saw her standing there, and the fury in his posture didn't disappear, but something in his face recalibrated, the way a camera refocuses when the subject changes. Something happened, she said. Nothing that affects tonight. That's not what I asked. He looked at her for a beat. One of my shipments was intercepted, a route that 3 people knew about. His jaw worked briefly. 2 of those people are in this building. Emma felt the weight of that settle. You have a leak. I have a problem, he said, which I will deal with after dinner. He crossed the room toward the bar cart, poured 2 fingers of vodka, drank half of it, and set the glass down. Are you ready? You're going to sit at a dinner table for 2 hours with whoever is coming, Emma said, knowing that someone in your organization sold you out today, and you're going to act normal. Yes. How? He looked at her with those pale eyes. The same way you sat at that restaurant table for 20 minutes after you'd been abandoned and didn't let a single person in that room see you fall apart. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. You already know how to do this. You've been doing it your whole life. Emma didn't have an answer for that. The men were named Petrov and Aldrin. Petrov was 60-something, broad, with the complexion of a man who had spent significant portions of his life outdoors in cold weather, and the eyes of someone who cataloged everything he saw and forgot very little of it. He was connected to the Chicago operation in ways that Emma did not yet have the vocabulary to fully map, but the way Dmitri's other men moved around him, with a specific deference that was different from the deference they showed Dmitri, more careful, less personal, told her he was important. Aldrin was younger, American, with the polished surface of someone who had come to this world through money rather than violence. He sat with his elbows on the table and leaned forward when he spoke, which was a habit of men who wanted to appear engaged but were actually assessing. They were at a private dining room on the 41st floor of a building in the Gold Coast. Not a restaurant, not exactly, a room that existed entirely for this kind of meal, accessible by a key-coded elevator that Dmitri had navigated without looking at his phone. A room that said, "This conversation does not exist outside these walls." Emma had been introduced as his wife, not fiancée, not girlfriend. Wife. Petrov had looked at her with the slow, thorough attention of a man reading a document he hadn't been informed would exist. Then he'd looked at Dmitri, then back at Emma, and something had shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but a recalculation. You didn't mention this, he said to Dmitri. No, Dmitri agreed. When? Recently. He said it with the absolute composure of a man who had decided on a single word and saw no reason to expand it. Aldrin was watching Emma with the particular quality of attention that she'd learned to identify in restaurants. The look of someone trying to find the seam in a performance. She met his eyes across the table and held them with the same steadiness she used when a customer was being difficult, and she needed them to understand she was not going to be rattled. He looked away first. Good. The dinner lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, and Emma did not make a single mistake. She answered questions with the right balance of directness and deflection, let Dmitri speak when the conversation entered territory she hadn't been briefed on, and twice, caught Petrov watching her with something that looked almost like reassessment. She didn't reach for Dmitri's hand or perform affection because she'd understood instinctively that performed affection would read as performed to these men, who had seen too many performed things to be fooled by them. What she did instead was be present, attentive to him without being deferential, the way a woman acts around a man she knows completely, including his silences. On the car ride back, Dmitri was quiet for 6 blocks. Then he said, Petrov will make 3 calls tomorrow morning. 2 of them will go the way I need them to go. Emma turned to look at him in the back of the SUV. And the third? The third is Kozlov. He was looking out the window. He'll tell him I have a wife now, that the situation has changed. A pause. Kozlov will want to see you. When? 3 weeks. There's a function, a legitimate one, a fundraiser, the kind of public event that certain people use for certain conversations. He turned to look at her. The city light moved across his face in strips. Can you do 3 more weeks of this before that happens? I just did 2 hours and 14 minutes of this with no preparation and 2 hours of sleep, Emma said. I think 3 weeks is manageable. The corner of his mouth moved. That not quite smile. You were very good tonight, he said. I know, Emma said, and looked back out her window and didn't let herself react to the warmth that had appeared somewhere in her sternum at those 4 words. The second week was when things started to crack. Not between Emma and Dmitri, between Emma and the world she'd agreed to inhabit, which turned out to have considerably sharper edges than the surface had suggested. It started with Roman. Roman Vasek was Dmitri's second-in-command, a lean, dark-haired man in his early 40s with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaws. and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now interesting in a more brutal way. He ran the daily operations of whatever the organizational structure actually looked like beneath the legitimate surface. And from the first morning Emma encountered him in the penthouse kitchen, pouring himself coffee with the ease of someone who had been in this space for years, he had looked at her like a problem that hadn't been solved yet. "You're up early," he said. Emma was also pouring coffee. She was in yesterday's clothes because she hadn't expected company before 7 a.m. "So are you." "I'm always here early." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You're not, usually." "I'm adjusting my schedule." "To what?" "To living here," she said. Roman put his cup down and leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who had decided to say something he'd been holding for several days. "How much did he pay you?" Emma looked at him. She set her own cup down with a small, deliberate motion. "What exactly do you think you know? I know Dmitri doesn't fall in love over dessert at restaurants." His voice was flat and precise. "I know he doesn't bring women here. I know the timing of this is not coincidental." He pushed off the counter. "I also know that whatever you agreed to, you don't know the full price of it yet. And I'm going to be the one dealing with the consequences when that becomes a problem." "Is that a threat?" Emma said. "It's information." "The next time you want to give me information," Emma said, "you can do it when you've been invited into a conversation instead of ambushing me in a kitchen at 6:50 a.m. She picked up her coffee. "And for what it's worth, I'm not unaware that there are things I don't know yet. I'm paying attention. I suggest you notice that." She left the kitchen before he could respond. She shook for about 30 seconds afterward in the hallway, hands tight around the mug, the anger moving through her in the way it always did, sharp and hot, and then cold, and then gone, leaving only the focused clarity underneath. She'd been managing men who underestimated her since she was 19 years old. Roman Vasek was not a new species, but he'd said something she couldn't stop turning over. "Whatever you agreed to, you don't know the full price of it yet." She found out what he meant 4 days later. Dmitri had been gone since early morning. A meeting that had required him to leave before she woke up, noted on the kitchen counter in his compressed, angular handwriting. "Back by 4. Don't leave the building today. No explanation." She'd spent the morning on her coursework and was 3 chapters into an operations management textbook when Marcus called up from the desk to tell her she had a visitor. She hadn't been expecting anyone. The woman who came up in the elevator was perhaps 45, dressed in the quiet, expensive way of old European money, with dark hair pulled back severely and cheekbones that looked carved. She looked around the penthouse with the expression of someone seeing a room they had expected to find different and finding it exactly as expected, which was somehow worse. "Mrs. Volkov," she said. The name landed strangely. Emma stood from the couch and said, "I'm sorry, who are you?" "Irina Petrov." A pause. "My husband and I had dinner with you last week." Petrov. Emma recalibrated immediately. The wife, who had not been at dinner, who had not been mentioned, who was now standing in this penthouse with the precise stillness of a woman who had learned a long time ago how to enter a room and own it without appearing to try. "Please sit down," Emma said. Irina sat. She accepted the offer of coffee with a small incline of her head and watched Emma make it with the attentiveness of a woman cataloging capability. "I'll be direct," Irina said when Emma sat across from her with 2 cups between them. "Please," Emma said. "My husband called Viktor Kozlov 2 days ago." Emma kept her face even. "I'm aware of that. Kozlov sent someone to investigate you, your background, your work history, your family." Irina looked at her steadily. "Your mother." Emma felt something go cold in her chest. "What about my mother?" "She's in a treatment facility in Evanston." Irina said it without softness, but also without cruelty, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "She has been for approximately 8 months. You've been paying the difference between what her insurance covers and what the facility actually costs. It's a significant number." The cold in Emma's chest spread, not because the information was a surprise. She knew what it cost. She'd been managing that particular arithmetic for the better part of a year, but because the fact that Kozlov now had it meant something specific and ugly. "He's going to use her," Emma said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He will use anything available to him. Irina looked at her with something that was not quite sympathy, but was something adjacent to it, the recognition of one woman for another who has been placed in a specific kind of danger. I'm telling you this because my husband has decided to support Dimitri's position, which means your safety is now connected to my husband's interests. A pause. But you needed to know this before Dimitri tells you or doesn't tell you, because how you handle the next week will matter more than you've been told. Emma looked at her. Why would Dimitri not tell me? Because he's been managing information about the Koslov situation very carefully, and because telling you about your mother means admitting that your personal life has already been compromised, and Dmitri Volkov does not easily admit the failures of his protection. Emma put her cup down. She looked at the city outside. Gray today, the sky low and heavy, snow threatening. She thought about her mother and the facility in Evanston, fragile and difficult, and the closest thing to a fixed point Emma had ever had, however imperfect. Thank you, she said. Irina stood. One more thing. She paused at the edge of the seating area. There's a man in Dimitri's organization, not Roman, someone beneath Roman, someone whose name you won't have heard yet. He's been feeding information to Kozlov for 11 months. She looked at Emma directly. Dimitri knows there's a leak. He does not yet know who. Emma absorbed this. Why are you telling me? Because you're paying attention, Irina said. I noticed that at dinner, and because the person who finds the leak first will be the person in the best position when this comes to a head. She moved toward the elevator. Welcome to the family, Mrs. Volkov. The elevator doors closed. Emma sat with her cold coffee and the information that had just been dropped on her like a building and thought, Roman was right. I didn't know the full price. Dimitri came back at 4:15 and Emma was waiting. She was sitting on the couch with her coursework open in front of her and a second cup of coffee, hot this time. And when he came through the door and saw her face, he stopped. What happened? He said. Irina Petrov was here. Something moved through his expression. Fast, controlled, but she caught it. Surprise and its immediate suppression. What did she say? That Kozlov had me investigated. That he has information about my mother. Emma kept her voice level. That you've been managing what you tell me about the Kozlov situation. She paused. Were you going to tell me about my mother? Dimitri took off his coat and set it over the back of a chair, which was a small motion that bought him 2 seconds, and Emma watched him use those 2 seconds and felt something tighten in her chest that was anger and something else she wasn't ready to name yet. I found out this morning, he said, and you were going to tell me. Tonight. He met her eyes. I was going to tell you tonight. I needed to assess the risk level before I told you, so I had something actionable to offer you at the same time. That's a very neat explanation, Emma said. It's the truth. It might be both. She looked at him. I told you in this room the first night I was here that if you lied to me about anything, I would leave. Withholding information about my mother from me for the entire day while you ran assessments, does that fall inside your definition of lying? The silence was long. No, he said. But it falls inside yours. And yours is the one that matters in the terms we agreed to. Emma blinked. She hadn't expected that. The directness of it, the acknowledgement without defense. Your mother is safe, he said. He moved to the chair across from her and sat with his forearms on his knees, the posture of a man trying to communicate that he was not hiding anything with his body, even when his body wanted to. I have 2 people at the facility now. Discreet, she won't know they're there. Koslov has the information, but he hasn't moved on it yet. He'll use it as leverage, not as an action, because she's worth more to him as a threat than as a target. You can't know that for certain. No, but it's the correct read. He held her gaze. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the moment I knew. Emma looked at him for a long time. She was trying to find the manipulation in it, the calculated apology, the managed disclosure, the performance of accountability designed to produce a specific result. She'd learned to look for those things. She'd gotten good at finding them. She couldn't find them here. Tell me about the leak, she said. His eyes sharpened. Irina told you about that too? Yes. He sat back slightly, looked at her with the focused, recalibrating attention she'd seen at the restaurant table a week ago. She told you I don't know who it is. She told me you know there is one. 11 months, he said, confirming Irina's number. Whoever it is has been careful. Small information, nothing that would trigger a catastrophic response, just enough to give Kozlov visibility into my operations. The shipment that was intercepted, Emma said. The night of the first dinner. 3 people knew the route. Yes. And you've cleared 2 of them? He looked at her with something that shifted the temperature in the room slightly. How did you... You said 2 of them were in this building, Emma said. You said it like a man who had already started the process of elimination. You haven't mentioned suspecting Roman, which means Roman cleared quickly. So it's someone below Roman. Dmitri was quiet for 5 full seconds. Yes, he said. Do you have a list? I have a working theory. Then tell me, Emma said. Not because I can help you catch him. I don't know your people well enough yet. But because if I'm in this building and I don't know who the threat is, I'm a liability. And I told you I'm paying attention. She looked at him steadily. Use that. The silence stretched between them, and Emma felt it. The weight of a man deciding how much to trust something he didn't have a category for yet. She knew what she was asking him to do. She was asking him to see her as something other than what she'd been hired to be. That was a different thing entirely. That was a door that didn't close once it opened. She watched him decide. His name is Oleg Sarin, Dmitri said. He's been with the organization for 4 years. He runs logistics on the south side distribution points. He looked at the window. I have 80% certainty. I need the 20 to move. What does the 20% look like? 1 confirmed transmission. I can see the pattern, but I can't see the act. Emma thought. Is there a delivery scheduled through his routes in the next 2 weeks? There's one Thursday. Tell him something about it that isn't true, Emma said. A detail, a time, a location, something specific. Tell only him. If that specific detail reaches Kozlov, then I have my 20%. Dmitri looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the recalibration of someone revising an estimate. Something quieter, something that moved beneath the surface of the controlled face he showed the world. That's a good play. It's basic operational security, Emma said. I read about it in a management textbook once. Context was different. The context was exactly the same, he said, almost to himself. Emma stood. She needed to move, to put some distance between herself and the feeling building in the room, which was the feeling of 2 people discovering that they were more compatible than either of them had planned for. That was the dangerous thing. That was the thing Irina Petrov's visit had not prepared her for. I'm going to call my mother's facility, she said. I need to check on her. I have the direct line for her attending physician. I know her attending physician's direct line, Emma said without heat. I've been managing this for 8 months. She went to her room and called, and her mother's voice on the phone was the same voice it always was. Slightly foggy from the medication, present, but at a remove. Warm in the specific and imperfect way it had always been warm. Emma sat on the edge of the bed in the east room with its better view and listened to her mother talk about the garden they'd installed at the facility, the small raised beds where patients grew tomatoes in the summer. And Emma said the right things and kept her voice easy and didn't say anything about what was happening 40 miles away in a penthouse with armed guards and a mafia boss who had just apologized to her and meant it. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her lap for a while. She thought about the handshake, the warmth of it that had been there in the morning. She thought about 2 hours and 14 minutes at a dinner table, and you were very good tonight, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd offered him a strategic play that worked, that quiet thing beneath the surface. She thought about Irina Petrov saying welcome to the family like it was a sentence that had weight. She thought about Roman's warning in the kitchen. Whatever you agreed to, you don't know the full price of it yet. She was beginning to understand the price. It wasn't danger. She'd priced danger in already, accepted it as a line item. The price was this: caring, the gradual, unwanted, completely irrational process of beginning to care about a man she had agreed to perform caring about, and discovering that the performance had somewhere along the way started to draw from a real source. That was the price. And it was higher than anything on the card he'd placed on the restaurant table. Thursday came. Dmitri told Oleg Sarin that the Thursday delivery had been moved to a different warehouse on the south side, a location that didn't exist, that Emma had suggested fabricating, that was specific enough to be convincing and verifiable enough to be tested. They waited. On Friday morning, Dmitri came to find Emma at the kitchen table where she was working through her coursework, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. His face was completely still. Kozlov sent 2 men to the warehouse address last night, he said. The address that doesn't exist. Emma set down her pen. Sarin, she said. Sarin. He said it without inflection, which was worse somehow than anger would have been. The flat weight of a man who had trusted someone for 4 years and was now calculating what that trust had cost him. What happens now? Emma asked. Now I deal with it. He held her gaze. Stay inside today. He left. Emma sat at the kitchen table and listened to the building settle around her, and she thought about what deal with it meant in Dmitri Volkov's vocabulary, and she thought about the fact that she was not horrified by what it meant, which was its own particular revelation about who she was becoming inside these walls. By evening, Roman came to her door, not to threaten her this time. He stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and his scarred face unreadable, and he looked at her with something that might have been, if she was reading it right, a grudging and specific respect. The Sarin thing, he said. Yes? That was yours. Dmitri made the call. After you gave him the play. Roman looked at her steadily. I've been with him for 9 years. In 9 years, I've seen him trust one person completely, and that person is buried in New Jersey. He paused. He told you about Sarin. He told you the number, 80%. He doesn't give numbers like that to people. Emma said nothing. I was wrong about you, Roman said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear it in the compression of the words, the way a man sounds when he's doing something his nature resists. Not wrong that this is complicated, but wrong about what kind of person you are. Okay, Emma said. He started to turn away. Roman. He stopped. The leak is handled now, but Kozlov knows he's been blocked. He sent those men, and they found nothing, and now he knows we know about him. She watched Roman's profile. What does he do when he's been blocked? Roman turned back. His expression had changed. He escalates, he said. How? Roman was quiet for a moment. Then, he comes at things that aren't supposed to be targets. Emma felt it then, the specific weight of what that meant. The thing Irina had said. Leverage. Her mother in the facility in Evanston behind 2 people Dmitri had placed there who were discreet and present and not nothing, but also not enough. Not if Kozlov decided that the leverage was worth converting into something harder. She thought about Dmitri's face when he'd said, I'm sorry I didn't tell you, and meant it. She thought about this feeling in her sternum that kept coming back no matter how many times she told it to stop. She thought about the fact that she had $60 in her checking account 14 days ago and a borrowed dress and a cab she almost couldn't afford. And now she was standing in a 40-story penthouse figuring out how to protect the most dangerous man in Chicago from the inside out. She thought, there is no version of the next few weeks that ends the way we planned. She thought, I knew that the moment I shook his hand. Then Dmitri's voice came from somewhere behind Roman, moving down the hallway with the compressed energy of someone who had just done something irreversible and was already moving past it. Emma. He appeared in the hallway, still dressed from whatever the day had been, shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms, something dark on the cuff that she did not let herself look at directly. We have a problem. I know, she said. He stopped, looked at her. Kozlov called Petrov 20 minutes ago. He knows about the fabricated address. He knows it was a trap. He held her gaze. He also said, a pause that lasted exactly long enough for Emma to feel her heartbeat, that he'd like to meet Mrs. Volkov personally, next week. Not at the fundraiser, privately. Emma looked at him. He's moving the timeline, she said. Yes? Because he wants to assess me before the public event. He wants to find the seam. Yes, she breathed. What happens if he finds one? Dmitri looked at her with those glacier eyes in the hallway light, and what she saw there was not the composed, unhurried authority she'd seen across restaurant tables and dinner parties. What she saw was something older and raw, something that lived beneath the controlled surface and had not been visible until this moment. Fear. Not for himself. Then this stops being strategy, he said quietly, and starts being war. Emma held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then we'd better make sure, she said, that he doesn't find one. She watched him look at her. She watched him see her. Not the arrangement, not the woman he'd hired, not the performance of a wife, but her, Emma Clark, standing in a hallway 40 stories above Chicago, holding her ground in the middle of something that had grown far beyond what either of them had agreed to. And she watched him realize in real time that he was in serious trouble. Not from Koslov, from her. The meeting with Koslov was set for Tuesday. 4 days. Dmitri gave her 4 days to prepare, which was not enough, and both of them knew it. But Koslov had set the terms, and Koslov was not the kind of man whose terms got renegotiated without consequence. The location was a restaurant in River North, public, theoretically neutral, the kind of place where powerful men conducted dangerous conversations behind the cover of normal life. Emma had worked 3 blocks from that restaurant for 2 years. She knew the neighborhood. She knew the way the lunch crowd moved through it, the sound of it, the specific quality of light through those north-facing windows in winter. Knowing the neighborhood was not going to be enough. Dmitri spent the first 2 days briefing her, not sitting her down with a document and walking through it. Nothing that formal. He talked while they moved through the routines of the penthouse, while she made coffee and he read reports, while they ate dinner at the kitchen table, with Roman occasionally present and occasionally not. He talked about Koslov the way a man talks about a wound he's learned to work around. Carefully, without looking directly at it, the information precise and the emotion underneath it compressed into the density of something that had been carried for a long time. Viktor Koslov was 51. He had built his syndicate from the remnants of 3 collapsed organizations, absorbing their assets and their personnel with the efficiency of a man who understood that loyalty was purchasable if you priced it correctly. He was not physically imposing, medium height, soft in the way that men who delegated their violence became soft. But he had a quality that Dmitri described once, briefly, as patience that feels like threat. He waited. He observed. He found the pressure point and he pressed it at the exact moment when pressing it would cause the most damage. "He's going to come at you sideways," Dmitri said on the second evening. They were at the kitchen table. Emma had her coursework open but hadn't looked at it in an hour. "He won't ask direct questions about us. He'll ask about you, your life before, your work, your family. He'll be charming. He'll be interested. He'll make you feel like the conversation is going well." "And then," Emma said, "and then he'll say something designed to destabilize you, a fact he shouldn't have, a detail about your mother, about your finances, about something private." He looked at her steadily. "When he does that, your instinct will be to react, to show him he's found something." "I know how to hold a face," Emma said. "Not to this," Dmitri said. There was no cruelty in it, just the flat honesty she'd come to recognize as his default. "He's been doing this for 30 years. He's watched people hold faces for 30 years. He knows what controlled looks like from 10 feet away." "Then what do I do?" Dmitri was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table between them, at the space where his hands rested, and Emma watched him work through something. Not the strategy, she thought, something harder. "You stop trying to control your reaction," he said. "You let him see something real, not the thing he's looking for, something else real. Anger, boredom, the specific irritation of a woman who has heard this kind of testing before and finds it beneath her." He looked up. "Make him feel like he underestimated you. That's more unsettling to him than a perfect performance." Emma looked at him. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've been thinking about how to protect you for 2 weeks, he said. He said it the same way he said everything. Directly, without decoration, without appearing to notice that it was the kind of statement that changed the temperature of a room. Emma looked at her coursework. "Okay," she said. "Tell me everything else." He thought. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of Chicago winter morning that felt personal. Emma dressed alone. She'd refused the offer of someone to help her. A woman whose name she hadn't caught, clearly experienced in the specific art of dressing women for high-stakes appearances, because she needed the 40 minutes of solitude to build something inside herself. The burgundy dress again. She'd worn it to the Petrov dinner, and it had worked, and she was not superstitious, but she was practical, and practical and superstitious were sometimes the same thing. Dmitri was waiting in the main room. He was wearing the charcoal suit again, the one from the restaurant, the first night, a detail she noticed and did not comment on. He looked at her when she came in with the same focused, complete attention as always. The kind of look she'd spent 2.5 weeks learning to receive without it affecting her equilibrium. She'd gotten better at it, not good enough. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but its structural precursor, the thing that happened in his jaw and his eyes before the smile formed. Emma turned toward the elevator before it could complete itself. The car ride was 20 minutes through mid-morning traffic. Dmitri sat beside her in the back of the SUV, and the city moved past the tinted windows, and neither of them spoke, which was a different kind of silence from the ones they'd had before. This one had weight. This one was the silence of two people who had covered the available ground of preparation and were now simply waiting for the thing to begin. His hand was on the seat between them, 2 inches from hers. Emma looked at it once and looked away. The restaurant was called Alder, street-level, exposed brick, the kind of cultivated casualness that cost a great deal of money to maintain. 2 of Dmitri's men were already inside. She clocked them without appearing to look, a habit she'd been developing without fully meaning to, the peripheral mapping of a room for exits and positions and the location of people who were something other than what they appeared to be. She'd started doing it 3 days into living in the penthouse and hadn't been able to stop. Viktor Kozlov was already seated. He stood when they approached, medium height, as advertised, a gray suit, impeccably fitted, a face that was open and pleasant in a way that her body registered as incorrect before her brain finished processing it, the face of a man who had learned to wear warmth as a tool. Brown eyes that were doing the same thing Dmitri's always did, reading, cataloging, assessing, but where Dmitri's attention felt like a searchlight, Kozlov's felt like a hand moving slowly through water, disturbing the surface gently, looking for what lay beneath without announcing the search. "Dmitri." The 2 men shook hands with the controlled formality of people who have extensive and violent history with each other, and have agreed to set it aside for 90 minutes. Then Kozlov turned to Emma, and his expression shifted into something warmer, more personal, and Emma felt it. The deliberate application of charm, precise as a surgical tool. "And this must be Emma." "Mrs. Volkov," Emma said. She shook his hand. His grip was measured, firm enough to communicate respect, brief enough to communicate that he was not performing, a practiced handshake. She filed it. They sat. The first 40 minutes were exactly what Dmitri had described. Kozlov was charming. He asked about her work history. She told the version she and Dmitri had refined, close enough to truth that no detail would crack under examination. He asked how they'd met, and Emma told the restaurant story with the modifications that made it a love story instead of a transaction. And she watched Kozlov listen to it with the attentiveness of a man checking a document against a known original. He asked about her family. Emma had prepared for this. "My mother is in Evanston," she said. "She's been dealing with some health issues. She's doing better." Flat, factual, slightly dismissive of the topic. The tone of a woman who doesn't discuss this with people she's just met. Kozlov nodded. Moved on. The food came. Dmitri ordered for both of them without consulting her, a thing they'd agreed on beforehand as a signal of the kind of easy familiarity that came from actual intimacy. And Emma watched Kozlov notice the gesture and file it. Then, 43 minutes in, Kozlov set down his fork. He looked at Emma with the pleasant, open expression that her body kept registering as wrong. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've done some research on you. I hope you don't mind." "Of course," Emma said. Emma Clark, 27. 4 years in Chicago restaurant work. Before that, 2 years at a hospitality program downstate. Your father left when you were 9. Your mother has been in and out of treatment facilities since you were 14. He said it the way someone reads a grocery list, the devastation of the content entirely separate from the tone of its delivery. You've been carrying the cost of her current placement on a waitress's salary for 8 months. Emma looked at him. She did not react. She let herself feel the invasion of it, the specific violation of having the private arithmetic of your survival laid out on a restaurant table by a man who had assembled it as a weapon. And she let some of that feeling show, not controlled, not performed, but real. The specific cold anger of a person who has been assessed as vulnerable. "I don't mind research," she said. Her voice was even and slightly cooler than it had been. "I mind the implication that it should make me uncomfortable." Kozlov smiled. "Not uncomfortable. I'm simply saying, You've carried a great deal on your own. It's admirable. A pause. It must be a relief to have found someone with resources. Emma held his gaze. I found someone I love. The resources are coincidental. Of course. He picked up his fork again, looked at Dmitri. She's good, he said, as if Emma were not present. I know, Dmitri said. The question, Kozlov continued, still looking at Dmitri, the pleasantness in his face unchanged, is whether she knows what she's actually in. The table went quiet. A specific kind of quiet, the kind that preceded something irreversible. Emma looked at Kozlov steadily. I know exactly what I'm in. Do you? He looked back at her. The warmth in his face had changed quality. Still present, but thinner. The performance of it slightly less maintained, the thing underneath beginning to show at the edges. Did Dmitri tell you about Natasha? The name landed in the silence like a dropped glass. Emma did not look at Dmitri. She kept her eyes on Kozlov and kept her face exactly where it was. And she thought, with the focused precision of someone doing arithmetic in a crisis, this is the thing. Whatever this is the thing he came here to say. I don't know who that is, Emma said. No, Kozlov said. I assume not. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a photograph on the table between them. He did it slowly, deliberately, the gesture of a man who had been waiting to make it. Her name was Natasha Volkov. She was Dmitri's wife, his actual wife. He paused. She died 14 months ago. Emma looked at the photograph. A woman, dark-haired, dark-eyed, the kind of beauty that was almost architectural in its precision, standing beside a younger-looking Dmitri. Not young, but something around his eyes that was different, less sealed, something present in his face that Emma had not seen in the 2.5 weeks she'd known him. She looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Kozlov. Why are you showing me this? She said. Because Dmitri's first wife died in a car accident that was arranged by someone in his own organization. Kozlov's voice was still pleasant, still conversational. The words arrived like blades wrapped in cloth. The same organization you're currently living inside. Emma breathed. And because I think, Kozlov continued, that a woman in your position, intelligent, observant, clearly not without survival instinct, deserves to know that the man she married has a specific and documented history of failing to protect the people closest to him. He stood, folding his napkin with the tidiness of someone who had accomplished what he'd come to do. I don't want you hurt, Emma. I want you to make an informed decision about where you're standing. He looked at Dmitri. We'll talk Thursday about the other matter. He left. Emma sat at the table. She did not look at Dmitri for a long time. She looked at the photograph still on the table between them, at the woman who had been real and was now dead, at the face of the man she'd been sleeping 40 feet away from for 2.5 weeks, the face that had been different when it was photographed beside this woman. Then she looked up. Dmitri's face was the stillest she had ever seen it. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his reactions. Something past that. Something that lived on the other side of control, in the territory where control had broken down completely, and what remained was simply the fact of a thing that could not be undone. Is it true? Emma said. Yes. The word came out stripped of everything. Tell me. He looked at her across the table in the restaurant where Kozlov had just performed a precise and deliberate demolition of everything they'd built, and Emma watched him decide, not whether to tell her, she could see that decision had already been made, but how to carry the weight of saying it out loud. Natasha died 14 months ago, he said. The car that hit hers was traced to a man named Fedorov. He worked logistics. He was paid by someone inside my organization. His jaw set briefly. I never found who gave the order. Emma was quiet. Is that why you needed a wife? She said. Not just the strategy, the other reason. Dmitri looked at her. You thought a new wife would draw out whoever ordered it, she said, because they'd see it as a threat to whatever they're protecting. Because if Natasha was killed to destabilize you, a new marriage destabilizes the person who gave that order. The words came out flat and measured, and she watched them hit him. I was bait. No. His voice sharpened for the first time. That is not... Don't. The word came out harder than she intended, cutting across his denial with the edge of something she hadn't felt since the night Derek had texted her from 3 feet away. Don't manage this. Was that part of the calculation or not? The silence was 6 seconds long. It was a secondary consideration, he said, that I told myself was minor, that I... He stopped. His hands were flat on the table. Yes, it was part of it. Emma sat with that. She thought about the card on the restaurant table, the number that had been more than 6 years of lunch shifts. She thought about every conversation in this building, every dinner, every moment of genuine connection she'd been cataloging with the terrifying precision of someone who was starting to care about something they couldn't afford to care about. She thought about Roman in the kitchen. Whatever you agreed to, you don't know the full price yet. She thought about the photograph of Natasha Volkov, who had been real and present and loved and was dead. Who in your organization knew about Natasha's route that day, she said. 3 people. Emma looked at him. 3 people. The same number who knew about the intercepted shipment. Dmitri went absolutely still. She watched it happen. Watched the thing she'd said arrive in his face like a physical impact, moving through the careful architecture of his self-control and finding something underneath it that was raw and exposed. His eyes changed. Something in them that had been contained for 14 months broke its container. The leak, he said, barely audible. Saren has only been in the organization for 4 years, Emma said. Her voice was steady. The steadiness of someone doing arithmetic in a crisis, holding the columns together by force of will. Natasha died 14 months ago. If Saren is the leak, he wasn't with us when she died. Dimitri's voice had a quality she had never heard in it before, a fracture underneath the surface, something that moved like the beginning of an earthquake moves underground before it reaches the surface. He couldn't have been the one who ordered, but he could be working for someone who was, Emma said. Someone already inside. Someone who was there 14 months ago and is still there and has been feeding Kozlov information for 11 months, which is 3 months after Natasha died, which means... She stopped. Dmitri was looking at her with those pale eyes, and the fracture in his voice had reached his face now, and Emma watched the most controlled man she had ever met come apart in increments across a restaurant table, and she thought, this is what Kozlov wanted, not to break me, to break him. Someone in your organization killed your wife, Emma said, quietly, as directly as he would have said it, and then 3 months later started feeding your enemy information. And you've been living with both of those things happening inside your walls without knowing they were connected. Dmitri said nothing. Does Roman know about Natasha's case, the investigation into Fedorov? Roman ran it, and he found nothing. He found Fedorov. Fedorov was dealt with. But not who hired him. No, Emma breathed. She looked at the photograph still on the table. I need you to tell me every name that knew Natasha's route that day. Emma. The 3 names, she said. Now. He looked at her for a moment, then he said 3 names. Emma repeated them in her head until they were fixed. The first was a man she'd never heard mentioned. The second was someone Roman had referenced once in passing, a senior figure in the organization's financial operations. The third was Roman. Emma kept her face exactly where it was. She picked up her water glass and drank from it, and set it down and looked at Dmitri with the controlled steadiness of a woman who had just received information that changed the shape of everything and was not going to let that show until she was alone and could think. We need to go back, she said. Chad, the ride back was nothing like the ride there. Dmitri sat with 3 inches of space between them, and the city moved past the windows, and Emma looked at it and thought in lists. The kind of lists she'd been making since she was 12 years old, since someone had to, since the alternative was panic, and panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. Roman had run the investigation into Natasha's death and found nothing. Roman had been with Dmitri for 9 years. Roman was the person Dmitri trusted with the operational details that could not be trusted to anyone else. Roman was one of 3 people who knew Natasha's route. Roman had also told Emma, 4 days into her time in the building, that someone in the organization was feeding information to Kozlov, and then he'd watched her find Saren. Emma thought about that, the specific shape of it. A man who had been feeding information to the enemy for 11 months, who ran the investigation into a murder he had possibly ordered, who pointed her toward a mole who turned out to be real. Because Saren was real, the trap had confirmed that, but who might also be a partial truth deployed to protect a larger lie. 2 leaks, not one. Saren, who was real and had been handled, and Roman, who might be something else entirely. She thought about Dmitri in the restaurant, the fracture moving through his face. She thought about 9 years of trust. She thought about the specific cruelty of Kozlov showing her that photograph, not to break her. Kozlov had correctly assessed that she was not easily broken, but to force Dmitri to say things out loud that had been sealed for 14 months, to reopen a wound in front of a witness, to make Dmitri see, through Emma's eyes, what the shape of his own betrayal looked like. Patience that feels like threat. She thought, Kozlov knows. Kozlov has known for some time who gave the order. That's why he put the photograph on the table, not to give Dmitri new information, to confirm that Dmitri was still in the dark, to check whether the wound was still operative. The car stopped. They were back at the building. Dmitri got out first and held the door, and Emma stepped out onto the pavement. And the cold air hit her face, and for a moment she stood on the sidewalk with the wind off the lake, cutting through the burgundy dress, and thought about how 16 days ago she'd been doing the math on $60 and a borrowed clutch. Inside. Elevator. The penthouse opened around them, and Emma walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water and drank all of it standing at the counter with her back to the room. Then she turned. Roman was there. Standing in the doorway to the main room with his arms crossed and his scarred face arranged in the expression she'd come to recognize as his neutral. Not hostile, not warm, just present and watchful. He looked at Dmitri first, read something in his face that made his own expression shift fractionally, then looked at Emma. "How did it go?" he said. Emma looked at him. She thought about 3 names. She thought about 11 months and 14 months, and the photograph of a woman with dark eyes who had been alive and was not anymore. She thought about what it meant to be in a room with a man who might have ordered that death and who had just spent 2 weeks telling her he'd been wrong about her and winning her trust with the grinding, specific credibility of someone who appeared to have earned it. She thought about Dmitri standing behind her, carrying 14 months of sealed grief and a fracture in his face that had not closed since the restaurant. She made a decision. "It went fine," she said. Her voice was completely even. "Kozlov is exactly what you said he'd be. We held the line." Roman looked at her for a long moment. The watchful attention that she'd read, until 20 minutes ago, as the wariness of a man protecting his position. "Good," he said. He left the room. Emma stood at the kitchen counter and looked at the space where he'd been. Dmitri came to stand beside her. Not close. 2 feet of distance, maintained with the precision of a man who is managing himself carefully. "You're not telling me something," he said quietly. Emma looked at the counter. She thought about what it meant to tell him. She thought about 9 years. She thought about the fracture in his face in the restaurant and what another fracture would do to a man who was already standing on cracked ground. She thought about Natasha. She turned to look at him. Those glacier eyes in the penthouse light, the scar along his jaw, the compressed, careful quality of a man holding himself together with both hands. "I need 1 more day," she said. "Before I tell you what I'm thinking, I need to be certain." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if I'm right," Emma said, "what I'm about to tell you is going to be the worst thing you've heard in 14 months. And I'm not going to say it until I'm certain enough that you can act on it instead of just surviving it." The silence between them was the longest one yet. "One day," he said. "One day," she confirmed. She went to her room and closed the door and stood with her back against it in the dark, and let herself feel for 30 seconds the full weight of what was happening. The danger and the grief and the specific terror of being a woman who had walked into a war thinking it was a transaction and had discovered somewhere in the middle of it that she was fighting it like it was her own. 30 seconds. Then she turned on the light and sat at the desk and opened her laptop and began to build the case with everything she had. Every name, every date, every detail that Roman had given her in the 2.5 weeks she'd spent watching and listening and paying attention to everything in this building with the focused precision of a woman who had been doing impossible arithmetic her entire life. She worked through the night. By 3 a.m. she had what she needed. By 4 a.m. she understood the full shape of the betrayal. Not just Roman, not just the leak, but something older and colder and more structurally devastating than she had imagined when she'd first heard those three names at a restaurant table. She sat in the lamplight of the east bedroom with the lake black and enormous beyond the window, and she thought about Dimitri's face when she'd said someone in your organization killed your wife, and she thought about what she was going to do with the truth she was now holding. There was no version of the next conversation that left things the way they were. There was no version of this that ended the way either of them had planned. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number she'd saved under a single initial, the person she'd told Dimitri about the first night, the one condition she'd named before shaking his hand. One person outside of this situation who knows broadly what's happening. She typed, "I need you to know that if you don't hear from me in 72 hours, something has gone wrong. The name is Roman Vasek." She sent it. Then she went to Dimitri's door and knocked. He answered immediately, which told her he hadn't slept either. She looked at him in the doorway in the dim light of the hallway, and she said, "I'm certain." And then she told him everything. She watched his face while she did it, and what she saw there was not the fracture she'd seen in the restaurant. What she saw was something colder and more complete, the face of a man who had just had the last version of his grief converted into something actionable, something that had direction and purpose and an address. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, stripped entirely of the smooth authority, down to something underneath that was older and harder and absolute. "Where is he now?" Emma looked at him. "Dimitri." She put her hand on his arm, the first time she had voluntarily touched him, a fact that registered for both of them in the half-second before everything else. "If you go to him right now, tonight, in this state, Kozlov wins. Because Kozlov has been waiting for exactly this, for you to react before you're ready." He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. "How long?" he said. 48 hours, she said. "Let me help you do this right." The silence was the kind that preceded earthquakes. 48 hours, he said. But something had already shifted in the building. Some weight redistributed, some structural element changed. And Emma, standing in the hallway with her hand on the arm of a man who had just learned the name of the person who killed his wife, understood that the 48 hours she'd asked for might already be... The 48 hours lasted 11. Emma knew it the moment she woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of the penthouse door closing. Not slamming, which would have been a warning she could have acted on, but closing with the careful, deliberate quietness of someone who did not want to be heard leaving. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, moving through the dark of the east bedroom with the focused instinct of someone whose body had learned, in 3 weeks of living in this building, to read its sounds like a language. The main room was empty. Dimitri's jacket was gone. The gun that usually sat on the kitchen counter in its holster, a fact she'd stopped flinching at around day 4, was gone. On the counter in its place was a note in his angular, compressed handwriting, and Emma picked it up and read it and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but lived in the territory between them. "Stay inside. Don't contact Roman. Marcus has instructions. No time. No plan. No 48 hours. Emma put the note down. She stood in the kitchen in the gray pre-dawn light and breathed through her nose for 10 seconds and thought about Dimitri's face in the hallway last night. The thing she'd seen underneath the controlled surface. The earthquake that had already started before she'd asked him to wait. She thought about the voice stripped to its oldest layer. Where is he now? She thought about 9 years of trust converted overnight into the specific, devastating energy of a man who had been patient for 14 months and had just run out of patience entirely. She thought, he's going to get himself killed. She picked up her phone and called the number she had for Marcus at the desk. "Mrs. Volkov." He answered on the first ring. "Where did he go?" A pause. "I'm not able to—" "Marcus." Her voice was level and cold, and she put into it the same quality she'd heard Dimitri use when he wanted a conversation to end in a specific direction. "Where?" Another pause. Longer. She could hear him deciding. "He took 3 men to a location on the south side," Marcus said. "A warehouse. He said he'd be back by 9. "Which warehouse?" "Mrs. Volkov, I really can't. Give me the address or I walk out of this building and find it myself." She meant it, and he could hear that she meant it. which is considerably more dangerous for everyone involved. The address came 30 seconds later. Emma changed her clothes in 4 minutes. Dark jeans, black sweater, flat boots she could move in. She was at the elevator in 5. Marcus was waiting in the lobby with the expression of a man who had just made a career decision he wasn't sure about. And beside him were 2 men she recognized from the building's security rotation, both of them with the careful, contained posture of people waiting to be told what to do. "You're coming with me," Emma told them. "Our instructions?" the taller one started. "Have just been updated," Emma said. "Let's go." The warehouse was in the South Loop, 6 blocks from the lake, the kind of industrial building that the city's economic geography had been slowly converting to loft apartments for a decade, but hadn't reached yet. Gray concrete, loading dock doors, the windows on the upper level covered from inside. 2 black SUVs were parked at angles outside the main entrance with the specific placement of vehicles positioned for quick departure rather than normal parking. Dimitri's cars. Emma's driver pulled up half a block back and stopped, and Emma looked at the building through the windshield and thought about what was happening inside it, and felt her heartbeat doing something she didn't have time to indulge. Then she heard it, a sound from inside the building. Not quite a gunshot, something heavier, a concussion that moved through the wall and the air and arrived in Emma's sternum like a fist. Then another, then silence that was worse than the sound. Emma was out of the car before the second echo died. "Mrs. Volkov," the taller guard started. "Stay here," she said. "If I'm not out in 10 minutes, call Petrov, not the police, Petrov." She looked at him until he nodded. Then she moved toward the building. The side door was unlocked. Someone had come through it recently enough that the latch hadn't fully caught, the door resting against the frame without sealing. Emma pushed it open slowly and stepped into the building's interior. It was a single large space, the kind of warehouse that had been used for storage and then abandoned when the economics shifted. Concrete floors, iron support columns, light coming through the covered upper windows in thin strips. The smell of the place was cold and mineral, and something underneath it that she identified and did not look at directly. Dimitri was standing 30 feet away. He was alive. That was the first thing she registered, so quickly that she understood in the registering of it how much she had been terrified he wouldn't be. He was standing with his back partially to her, his posture carrying the specific tension of someone in the aftermath of extreme physical exertion. Shoulders high, breathing visible. The controlled collapse of a body coming down from adrenaline. 3 of his men were positioned around the space, 2 of them with the watchful stillness of people waiting for orders. One of them sitting against a support column with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his face the color of old paper. Roman was on his knees on the concrete floor 8 feet from Dimitri. His hands were behind his back. His face was turned slightly away, and Emma could see from where she stood the damage that had been done to it. The eye swollen shut, the cut along his cheekbone, the split in his lower lip that was still seeping. He was breathing in the shallow, careful rhythm of someone managing pain, each inhale a controlled decision. Dimitri heard her before she spoke. He turned, and his face when he saw her did several things in rapid succession. The relief, the anger at the relief, the harder anger at her presence here, all of it moving through his expression in the 2 seconds before he locked it down. "I told you to stay inside," he said. "You told me 48 hours, Emma said. "You left in 11. His jaw tightened. He crossed the space between them in 4 steps, moving her back toward the door, with the controlled force of his presence, lowering his voice. "This doesn't concern you." Emma looked past him at Roman on the floor, at the man against the column with his hand over his shoulder, at the 2 standing guards, at the gun still in Dimitri's right hand, held with the casual familiarity of long use. "It concerns me entirely," she said. "I'm the one who told you last night. Whatever happens here, it runs through me." "Emma, did he talk?" Dimitri looked at her for a beat. The anger in his face was real, present, but underneath it was something she recognized, the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had run, finally, out of the capacity to carry it. "Not enough," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means he confirmed the order for Natasha." The words came out stripped, flat, delivered with the precision of someone who had decided the only way to say them was without weight, because with weight they were unsurvivable. He will not give me Kozlov's role in it. Because Kozlov wasn't involved, Emma said. Dmitri's eyes sharpened. I've been thinking since 3 a.m., Emma said. Kozlov put the photograph on the table. He knew about Natasha's death, about the investigation, about Fedorov, but he presented that information to destabilize you, not to take credit for it. A man who ordered a hit doesn't use it as leverage. He buries it. The fact that Kozlov is using Natasha's death as a weapon against you means he didn't control it. She held his gaze. Roman acted alone. Or not alone, but without Kozlov, which means Kozlov and Roman have been operating in parallel, both exploiting the same weakness in your organization, without coordinating. The warehouse was very quiet. Dmitri looked at her with an expression she had no previous category for. Why? He said. Not to Roman, to her. Why would Roman act alone? Emma looked past him at the man on the floor. At the scarred face, one eye swollen shut, turned slightly away. She thought about 9 years. She thought about the specific quality of Roman's wariness when she'd arrived, the way he'd come to her kitchen at 6:50 a.m. to warn her, the grudging respect he'd shown after the sarin operation. She thought about what it looked like from inside. A man who had been second in command for 9 years, who had run operations and managed crises and held the organization together through every external threat. Watching Dmitri bring in a woman he didn't know and move her into the center of everything within 72 hours. He thought you were going soft, Emma said. He's thought it for a while. The legitimate businesses, the public events, the time you've spent building something that doesn't end in blood. She paused. Natasha was part of it. She was making you less of what he needed you to be. He didn't want you destroyed. He wanted you sharpened. He thought losing her would do it. The silence that followed was the worst one she had ever been in. She watched Dmitri's back. She watched him breathe. She watched the thing she'd just said arrive in him the way it had arrived in her at 3 a.m. Not as information, but as a weight, the specific gravity of a betrayal that had been done in the name of loyalty, which was the cruelest possible architecture for it. Dmitri. Her voice was quiet. He's going to tell you he did it for the organization, that he did it for you. And some part of you is going to want to believe that because 9 years is a long time, and because the alternative is that someone you trusted completely made you into something you never agreed to be. She stepped closer. Don't believe it. What he did made you into exactly what Kozlov needed you to be. Isolated, grief-driven, and consumed enough with internal threat that you didn't see the external one clearly until it was almost too late. Dmitri turned. His face was the controlled mask, fully restored, every fracture sealed, but his eyes were the pale, still color of ice over deep water, and Emma knew, with the certainty she'd been building for 3 weeks of watching this man, that the stillness was not absence of feeling. It was the thing feeling became when it had nowhere left to go except forward. He walked back to Roman. He crouched down in front of him, putting himself at eye level with the man on the floor, and Emma stood where she was and watched. Look at me, Dmitri said. Roman turned his face. The undamaged eye found Dmitri's face and held it with something Emma had not expected. Not fear, not defiance, but a terrible, exhausted grief that was its own kind of answer. 9 years, Dmitri said. Roman said nothing. Tell me why. Quiet. Absolute. Roman breathed. The sound of it was effortful, the breath of a man working through damaged ribs. You were disappearing, he said. His voice was wrecked. Every year. Less of what you were, more of this. A pause. She was good for you. I know that. I knew it then. But she was making you into someone who couldn't survive what's coming. So you had her killed. I made a decision for the organization. You made a decision for yourself. Dmitri's voice did not rise, did not change in pitch or volume. This was the version Emma had read about in 3 hours of late-night research. The cold, the absolute, the thing underneath the surface that had made men twice his age step back. You decided what I should be. You decided what I should lose. A pause. Did you think I wouldn't find out? I thought... Roman stopped, swallowed. I thought it would make you harder. I thought you'd go to war and win, and come out the other side as what you were supposed to be. Something broke in his voice briefly. I didn't think it would break you. The silence after that was enormous. Then a phone rang, not Dimitri's. One of the standing guards reached into his jacket and looked at the screen, and his face changed. The sharp, alarmed reconfiguration of someone receiving information they were not prepared for. He crossed to Dimitri in 3 steps and said something close to his ear. Emma watched Dimitri's face. She watched it do nothing, which was worse than any reaction she'd seen from him yet. The controlled mask absolute, the pale eyes still, and beneath it something that her body registered before she'd processed the words the guard had said. Dimitri stood. He looked at Emma. They have your mother, he said. The floor did not move. The concrete was solid beneath her feet, and the cold air of the warehouse was solid in her lungs, and Emma Clark stood in the south loop in the gray morning light and felt everything she'd spent 27 years building, the discipline, the control, the focused precision of a woman who did not fall apart in public. Register the impact of those 4 words and hold. Hold. Who? She said. Her voice did not shake. She was intensely proud that it did not shake. Kozlov's men, 40 minutes ago at the facility in Evanston. Dimitri held her gaze. They took her from the facility. She's unharmed. We have confirmation of that. But they're moving her. To where? We're tracking. He turned to the guard. Rapid Russian, 2 sentences. The guard moved immediately, phone already at his ear. Dimitri turned back. We will find her. How long? 1 hour, maybe less. Emma breathed. 1 breath, carefully managed, in and out. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone, the slightly foggy warmth of it, the tomatoes and the raised beds, the way she'd said, I love you, sweetheart, before hanging up in that specific tone that she'd had since Emma was small, unchanged by everything else that had changed. This was always the plan, Emma said. Not a question. Yes, Kozlov knew about the meeting. He knew about Roman, or suspected. He moved on my mother as a contingency. If the meeting went badly for him, he wanted a lever. She looked at Dimitri. He's going to call you. He already has. Dimitri's jaw was set. 10 minutes ago. That's what the guard told me. What did he say? He wants a meeting, tonight, private location. A pause. He wants you present. Emma looked at him. He wants to trade, she said. My mother for my presence at a meeting where the actual terms are the surrender of your operation or the deaths of both of us. That is the correct read, Dimitri said. And you're going to tell me not to go. I'm going to tell you. Well, Dimitri. She cut across him cleanly. My mother is 61 years old. She has been in a treatment facility for 8 months, working harder than anyone I know to put herself back together. And she is there because she is trying, and Kozlov's men pulled her out of the one place she felt safe. Emma's voice was level and even, and underneath it was a heat that she didn't fully recognize as her own, something that had been building in the 3 weeks of this building and these rooms and this man, and was now finding its direction. I am going. Emma, I am going, she said. The question is whether we go prepared or whether we go reactive. And I need to know everything about the location before we make a single other decision. Dimitri looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Then he said to the room, Get me everything on the Halstead warehouse. The next 6 hours were the most focused of Emma's life. They worked from the penthouse, Roman secured and removed from the situation. The 3 men from the warehouse redistributed to positions Dimitri specified with the clipped efficiency of someone converting grief into geometry. Petrov was called. Not Irina. The man himself, who answered on the first ring and listened without interrupting and said, at the end, a single word in Russian that Dimitri translated as done, and 6 men Emma had never seen began appearing at the building's service entrance with the quiet, purposeful movement of people who did this for a living. Emma sat at the kitchen table with a floor plan of the Halstead warehouse, pulled from city property records in 11 minutes by a man whose specific skills she'd stopped asking questions about, and a legal pad and 2 pens. She mapped the entry points. She mapped the sight lines. She thought about everything she'd learned in 3 weeks about how Dimitri's organization moved, how it communicated, what its response time looked like when something needed to happen fast. Dimitri worked across the table from her. They didn't talk much. The silence between them was the dense, pressurized silence of shared purpose. Two people oriented toward the same problem. The ambient noise of their own earlier conversation compressed beneath the weight of what was immediately necessary. At one point, he put a cup of coffee beside her hand without a word. She didn't look up. "Thank you." He sat back down. The leg of his chair scraped against the kitchen floor. Emma turned a page on the legal pad. At 4 in the afternoon, Dmitri's phone rang. He looked at the screen, put it on the table between them. Kozlov's number. Emma looked at it, then at Dmitri. She turned the legal pad toward him so he could read what she'd written, a sequence of 4 words in block letters, and she watched him read them and saw something in his face that was not quite approval, but lived right next to it. He picked up the phone. "Victor." His voice was the smooth, unhurried authority, fully restored, every fracture sealed, the performance of a man who had not spent the last 6 hours converting loss into a plan for war. "We accept your terms. Tonight." Kozlov spoke. Emma could hear the shape of it from across the table, measured, pleased, the tone of a man who believed he had successfully moved all the pieces to where he needed them. "My wife will be there," Dmitri said, "as you requested." He paused, listened. His eyes came to Emma's face, brief and direct. "Yes. She understands the terms." Another pause. "I'll see you at 9. He hung up, looked at her. "He believes it," Emma said. "Yes. Because you sounded like a man who had run out of options." "I am a man who has run out of options," Dmitri said. The honesty of it arrived without self-pity, just the flat delivery she recognized. "The difference is that running out of options means I have one left." He looked at the legal pad. "This one." Emma looked at the floor plan, at the 4 entry points, at the notation she'd made about timing and position and the specific non-negotiable requirement that her mother be in the car outside the building before anyone moved on anything inside it. "If your men get her out first," she started. "They will." "Dmitri." She looked at him. "If they don't, we abort. No matter what stage we're at. We walk out." He held her gaze. "We're not walking out of a Kozlov meeting once we're inside it." "I know that," Emma said. "So make sure they get her out first." He nodded, looked at the floor plan for a moment longer. Then he looked up and across the table and said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual register, stripped of the authority and the strategy and the performance of control, "I should have told you about Natasha before Kozlov did." Emma looked at him. "Yes," she said, "you should have. I know that the omission was—" "Stop." She shook her head. "Not tonight. We do tonight first. Then we talk about the things we should have done differently." She held his gaze. "Agreed?" The pause was brief. "Agreed," he said. She looked back at the floor plan. She thought about the borrowed dress and the $60 and the restaurant and the handshake and the warmth of it that had still been there in the morning. She thought about 14 days becoming 3 weeks, becoming something she didn't have a word for yet, something that lived in the space between the arrangement they'd agreed to and the reality of who they'd been to each other in this building, in these rooms, in the kitchen conversations and the dinner preparations, and the 2 a.m. lights, and the specific particular intimacy of 2 people doing arithmetic together in a crisis. She thought, afterward. Think about that afterward. She picked up her pen and circled the east entrance on the floor plan. "Tell Petrov's men to come in from the east," she said. "Kozlov will watch the west. It's the more obvious approach from the street, and he'll concentrate there. East gives us 4 seconds he won't be expecting." Dmitri looked at the floor plan, looked at the circle, looked at her. 4 seconds is not much, he said. "It's enough," Emma said. "For the right person, in the right position." She looked up. He was looking at her with those glacier eyes and the scar along his jaw and the compressed, absolute quality of a man who was about to walk into the most dangerous thing he'd walked into in a long time. And something was present in his face that hadn't been present at the restaurant table on Christmas Eve. Something that the 3 weeks in these rooms had put there, and Emma looked at it and looked away and wrote 3 more notations on the legal pad with her hand steady and her heart doing something she didn't have time to address until after. At 8:30 p.m., they went down to the cars. The building lobby was full of people that Emma did not know in configurations that looked like an ordinary evening until you understood the geometry of them. The positioning, the readiness, The way everybody in the space was oriented with the unconscious precision of people who had trained for exactly this kind of night. Marcus was at the desk. Emma stopped in front of him. "If neither of us is back by midnight," she said, "you contact my mother's facility in Evanston and you tell them she'll be needing her room again." She looked at him steadily. "And then you call Irina Petrov." Marcus looked at her. Something moved through his face, the same recalibration she'd seen in other people's faces over the past 3 weeks, the look of someone revising an assessment. "Yes, Mrs. Volkov," he said. She went to the car. Dmitri was already in the back seat. She got in beside him, and the door closed and the city moved past the tinted windows, and she thought about the legal pad and the floor plan and the 4 seconds and her mother's voice and the note on the kitchen counter that had read, "Don't leave the building today on the morning." All of this was still theoretical. The warehouse was 20 minutes away. At the 12-minute mark, Dmitri's phone buzzed. He looked at it. His jaw tightened fractionally. "Petrov's men are in position," he said. "East approach, as you specified." Emma nodded. 30 seconds later, a second buzz. He looked at the phone, and this time Emma watched his face very carefully, because she had learned in 3 weeks to read the things that happened in it at speed, the things he did not mean to show. She saw relief. Not happiness, not triumph. The specific bare relief of someone who had been afraid of a specific thing and has just been told it hasn't happened yet. "Your mother," he said, "is in the extraction vehicle. She's safe." He looked up. "She's asking why there are men with guns." Emma let out a breath. One breath, slow and controlled, and she let herself feel the relief for exactly 3 seconds. Felt it completely, the warmth of it, the loosening of something she'd been holding tight for 6 hours. And then she sealed it because the building was 6 minutes away, and she needed everything she had for what came next. "Tell them to keep her comfortable," Emma said. Dmitri relayed the message in Russian, put the phone in his jacket. The car slowed. Through the windshield, the Halstead warehouse materialized from the dark of the street. Gray concrete loading dock, 2 black SUVs parked at angles in the lot. The same geometry as this morning, but different. The same architecture serving a different and more dangerous meeting. Dmitri looked at her. "Ready?" he said. Emma looked at the building. She thought about the 4 seconds and the east entrance and everything she'd put on the legal pad in the last 6 hours. She thought about the way Dmitri had said, "I should have told you," and meant it. She thought about standing in a restaurant on Christmas Eve with $60 in her account and a borrowed dress, and the arithmetic of staying afloat grinding away beneath everything, and the voice behind her that had said that seat looks like it's been wasted on the wrong person. She looked at him. "One thing," she said. "When we get in there, whatever Kozlov says, whatever he puts on the table, whatever it looks like he has, Paul, you trust me. You let me play it the way I've planned." She held his gaze. "Don't react until I signal. You'll know the signal." Dmitri looked at her. "What's the signal?" "I'll say your name," Emma said. "Your actual name, not Volkov." "Dmitri." A pause. "I haven't said it yet. In 3 weeks, I've never used your first name. When I do, you move." The silence lasted 4 seconds. "Okay," he said. The car stopped. They got out into the cold and walked toward the entrance of the warehouse, where Viktor Kozlov was waiting with whatever he had decided their lives were worth, and Emma Clark, who had been abandoned at a dinner table 3 weeks ago, and had done the math on $60 and a borrowed dress, and had shaken the hand of the most dangerous man in Chicago, and discovered, somewhere in the arithmetic of surviving him, that she had stopped trying to leave. Walked forward into the dark with her chin up and her heartbeat steady and the word Dmitri ready on her tongue like a detonator, waiting for the exact right moment to... The warehouse smelled like cold concrete and machine oil, and the specific mineral stillness of a space that had been emptied of its original purpose and not yet given a new one. Emma walked in first, not because Dmitri let her, because she moved through the door at a pace that made stopping her a choice rather than a default, and she heard him 1/2 step behind her and felt the controlled tension of a man keeping himself from reaching forward, and she thought, "Good, stay there, stay exactly there," and kept walking. The interior was lit by portable flood lamps, 4 of them positioned at the corners of the space, casting the kind of flat, directionless light that removed shadows and made everything look slightly unreal, like a stage set assembled by someone who understood atmosphere but not beauty. 12 men that Emma counted without appearing to count, positioned in a loose perimeter. All of them still, all of them watching. Koslov was in the center of the space, standing beside a metal folding table with 2 chairs on one side and one on the other, and Emma thought even now the one chair is the tell. He wants us seated together so he can stand over us, so the geometry of authority favors him. She walked to the table and sat in one of the 2 chairs. Dmitri sat beside her. Kozlov looked at this for a moment. Something moved in his pleasant face. The brief recalibration of a man whose staging had been engaged with rather than submitted to. He sat in the single chair across from them and folded his hands on the table with the composed patience that Dmitri had described as patience that feels like threat. "Emma," he said, "I'm glad you came." "You took my mother," Emma said. "I didn't have a lot of other options." "She's perfectly safe. She's in a car outside your warehouse at 9 p.m. being kept company by men with guns," Emma said. "That's not safe. That's hostage adjacent." She looked at him with the level, slightly cooler quality she'd used at the restaurant, the specific register of a woman who finds the situation beneath her despite its stakes. "Let's not pretend otherwise." Koslov looked at her. The pleasant expression remained. "I've been trying to understand you," he said. "Since the dinner. You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier." He said it without apology. A woman in a difficult financial situation who had made a transaction and was performing its terms. Those women are manageable. He looked at her steadily. "You're not performing." Emma said nothing. "That complicates things," Koslov continued. He looked at Dmitri. "You told her about Natasha." "She told me," Dmitri said. His voice was the smooth, controlled register. No fracture, no heat, the surface of a man who had decided on stillness as his weapon tonight. "She figured most of it out herself." Koslov looked back at Emma. "And that didn't make you leave?" "No," Emma said. "Why not?" Emma looked at him across the metal table in the flat warehouse light and thought about how to answer that. And what she said was the truth, because the truth was the only thing that would work here, with this man, who had spent 30 years reading, performed things, and finding their seams. Because the person who needed protecting wasn't the arrangement, she said. It was him. The silence after that was very complete. Koslov looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that was not part of the strategy. Something that arrived from a deeper layer, the involuntary response of a man encountering a thing that is simply true. He looked at Dmitri. "She means it," he said, almost to himself. "I know," Dmitri said. Koslov breathed. He unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table and looked at them for a moment. The posture of a man taking a reading on himself. "Here is the situation," he said. "I came to Chicago with a specific outcome in mind. The Volkov organization, absorbed. The logistics network, restructured under my operation. The real estate holdings, transferred." He looked up. "Roman's cooperation was supposed to accelerate that. Your discovery of Roman has complicated the timeline. Roman acted without your direction," Emma said. Koslov looked at her sharply. "Natasha," she said. "That wasn't you." A pause, brief but present. "No," he said. "It wasn't. You found out after." Emma watched his face. "And you used it, but you didn't order it, which means your position here is different from what you've been presenting. You're not the man who arranged a murder. You're the man who exploited one. That's a meaningful distinction." She held his gaze. "For both of us." Koslov was very still. "What are you doing?" Dmitri said quietly beside her. Not a warning, a genuine question. "What you asked me to do 3 weeks ago," Emma said. She didn't look at him. "Reading the room." She looked at Koslov. "You're not going to get what you came for tonight, not because of the men outside, although they are outside, and not because Petrov is positioned in ways you haven't accounted for, but because the architecture of what you built here has been compromised at the foundation." She paused. "You needed Roman. Roman is gone. You needed me to be someone who could be pressured through her mother. I'm here voluntarily. You needed Dmitri to be isolated and grief-consumed enough that a forced acquisition was the only remaining option." She looked at him steadily. "He's neither of those things anymore." Koslov looked at her for a long time. So what are you proposing? He said. I'm not proposing anything, Emma said. I'm telling you the situation. What you do with it is your decision. The warehouse was silent except for the sound of the city outside. Distant traffic, wind off the lake, the ordinary machinery of a Chicago winter night continuing without awareness of what was happening inside this building. Emma sat with her hands in her lap, and her heart beat at a pace she was managing with everything she had and her face arranged in the stillness she'd been building since she was 12 years old, and someone had needed to hold things together. Kozlov stood. He walked 2 paces away from the table, his back to them, and stood there for a moment. Emma watched his shoulders. Dmitri was absolutely motionless beside her. She could feel the tension in him from 6 inches away, the compressed, absolute readiness of a man who had been given a specific instruction and was holding it with everything he had. Don't react until I signal. Kozlov turned back. The Halstead corridor, he said. The 4 distribution points on the south route. I want access. No, Dmitri said. An agreement of non-interference, then. My operation expands east. Your western boundary holds. Kozlov looked at him. A line, held by both sides. The silence stretched. Emma said nothing. This was not her terrain. The actual architecture of the arrangement, the geography of criminal infrastructure, the specific terms of a peace between 2 organizations that had been circling each other toward war for 14 months. This was Dmitri's. She had done what she came to do. She waited. The Irving Park line, Dmitri said. North of that is mine. You stay south and east. Whacker, Kozlov countered. Madison, Dmitri said. A pause. Monroe, Kozlov said. And something in the quality of the word, the slight compression of it, the finality, told Emma that this was the real number, that Monroe was where he'd been trying to get all along, that everything before it had been the approach to this. Dmitri was quiet for 4 seconds. Monroe, he said, and you return her mother tonight, not tomorrow, not in the morning, in the next 30 minutes. Kozlov nodded. Roman, Dmitri said. His situation is mine to deal with. You have no claim on it. Another nod. Then we're done here, Dmitri said. Kozlov looked at him, then at Emma. The pleasant face had changed again. Not warmer exactly, but something had gone out of it, some operational quality, the tool put down. What remained was closer to the actual man, whoever that was, and Emma found she had very little curiosity about him. You picked well, Kozlov said to Dmitri. He was looking at Emma. I know, Dmitri said. They left the warehouse. Again, the cold outside was absolute and clean, and Emma stood on the concrete apron in front of the loading dock and breathed it in and felt the shaking start in her hands. The delayed physical response to 2 hours of holding everything together, the body's invoice for the adrenaline, arriving now that it was over and she'd let down the internal bracing. She folded her hands together and breathed through it. Dmitri came to stand beside her. Not touching, the same careful distance he always maintained, the man who had never once overstepped in 3 weeks, and looked at the parking lot and the dark and the city lights beyond. The Monroe line, Emma said. Is that workable? It's better than war, he said. That's not what I asked. Yes, he said. It's workable. Emma nodded. Her hands had stopped shaking. A car pulled into the lot. One of Petrov's, a dark sedan, moving slowly. It stopped 20 feet away, and the rear door opened, and Emma walked toward it before it had fully stopped and her mother got out wrapped in a coat that wasn't hers, borrowed from whoever had been keeping her company for the past 8 hours. Her face confused and frightened. And then, when she saw Emma, the confusion dissolved into something that was the most straightforward emotion Emma had seen in weeks. Her mother said her name. Emma held her. She stood in the parking lot of a warehouse in the South Loop on a January night with her mother's arms around her, and her face pressed briefly into her mother's shoulder. And she felt the whole 3 weeks of it. The borrowed dress, and the check, and the handshake, and the dinners, and the kitchen conversations, and the 3 a.m. lists, and the photograph on the restaurant table, and Dmitri's face when the fracture had moved through it, and the 48 hours that became 11, and the detonator word she'd held on her tongue all the way through the warehouse door, all of it arriving at once, briefly, completely, and then receding. She pulled back, looked at her mother's face. Are you hurt? No, they were surprisingly polite, actually. Her mother frowned. Emma, what is happening? Who are these people? I'll explain, Emma said. Not tonight, soon. She held her mother's face between her hands for a moment. The specific, imperfect, beloved face that she'd been paying $11 an hour plus tips to protect, and breathed. Tonight you're coming home with me. I have a room with a view of the lake. You're going to sleep in it. Her mother looked at her, looked past her at Dmitri, standing 20 feet back, watching. Is that him? She said. Emma looked back at Dmitri. At the charcoal suit and the scarred jaw and the pale eyes that had found her face the moment she turned, the way they always did, without having to search for it. Yes, Emma said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. He's been watching you since you got out of the car, she said. I know. Not the way men usually watch women, her mother said. Emma looked at her. The other way, like he's checking to make sure you're still there. Emma didn't have an answer for that. She took her mother's arm and they walked back toward the cars. Well, the penthouse at midnight was a different world from the warehouse. Emma's mother sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she'd made herself. Finding the kettle and the cups without being shown, the specific independence of a woman who had spent 8 months working hard at her own recovery and was not about to stop now, and looked around the space with the expression of someone processing an enormous amount of information and choosing to begin with the least complicated of it. This is a very large apartment, she said. Yes, Emma said. You didn't mention this when you called. I mentioned a job offer. Her mother looked at her. The slightly foggy warmth that the medication sometimes put in her face was absent tonight. The adrenaline of the evening had burned through it, leaving her clearer and sharper than Emma usually found her, the woman her mother had been before the difficult years reassembled in the kitchen light. Emma, she said, tell me the true version. Emma sat down across from her. She told her, not everything. Not the mechanics of Roman and Koslov and the organizational infrastructure, not the details that would serve no purpose except to frighten, but the shape of it, the arrangement, the terms, the 3 weeks, the way it had changed. She told it the way she'd learned to tell hard things, directly, without softening the edges, giving her mother the credit of being able to receive the truth. Her mother listened without interrupting, which was itself a measure of how much she'd changed in 8 months. When Emma finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. The money, she said, the arrangement. Is that still what it is? Emma looked at the table. I don't know what it is anymore, she said. Does he know that? I think so. Her mother wrapped both hands around the teacup, looked at it. Your father left because the life got too hard, she said. And I spent a lot of years after that teaching you, by accident, without meaning to, that the thing to do when something gets hard is to manage it alone. To keep doing the arithmetic until you found a number that worked. She looked up. You've been doing that your whole life, sweetheart. Every calculation, every list, every borrowed dress and counted dollar. A pause. I'm asking if this is the first time you've let someone else be part of the arithmetic. Emma looked at her mother. She thought about standing in the parking lot and the warehouse and the kitchen table at 4 a.m, and Dimitri's handwriting on the kitchen counter, the east bedroom has the better view, and she thought about a cup of coffee placed beside her hand without a word, and she thought about, you were very good tonight, and I should have told you, and 3 weeks of a man who had never once treated her as anything other than someone fully worth seeing. Yes, she said, I think so. Her mother nodded, drank her tea. Then you should probably tell him that, she said, instead of doing more arithmetic. Dmitri was in the main room. He was standing at the window. He was always at the window, she thought. The man and his city. The relationship between them containing something she'd been observing for 3 weeks without fully articulating. He turned when she came in. The suit jacket was gone. The shirt was untucked slightly at one side, the only disorder she'd ever seen in his appearance. And it made him look less like the architecture he usually was, and more like a person. She's settled? He said. She's making a second cup of tea and looking at your book collection with an expression I can only describe as judicious. Emma stopped a few feet from him. She'll be fine. He nodded. The silence between them was not the pressurized, purposeful silence of the past 6 hours. It was something softer and more exposed. The silence of two people at the end of something who are not yet sure what comes next. What you did in there, Dmitri said. I read the room, Emma said. You told me to. I told you 3 weeks ago that it might be useful. He looked at her. I did not expect you to dismantle Kozlov's entire strategic position in 8 minutes with a factual assessment. He was ready to be done, Emma said. He'd gotten what he could get from the situation, and he knew the foundation had shifted. He needed someone to give him a door. She paused. I gave him a door. You gave him Monroe, Dmitri said, and something in his voice suggested that this was not a criticism, but its opposite. You gave him Monroe, Emma said. I gave him the conversation that made Monroe possible without blood. He was quiet for a moment. The arrangement, he said. He said it the way you say a word you're testing for current accuracy, checking whether it still means what it used to mean. The terms we agreed to, the contract. Yes. I want to renegotiate them, he said. Emma looked at him. On what basis? On the basis that the terms no longer describe the actual situation, he said. His voice was the direct, undecorated register she'd come to recognize as the one he used when he was saying something he meant completely. The contract was for a performance. What has been happening in this building for 3 weeks is not a performance. He held her gaze. I think we both know that. Emma breathed. The original terms guaranteed you money and an exit, he said. I'm not withdrawing either of those. They stand regardless of what you decide, but I'm asking... He stopped. Something moved briefly in his face, the effort of a man unused to the specific vulnerability of asking. I'm asking if you would consider staying, not because of the contract, because of what this actually is. Emma looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother's voice. Is this the first time you've let someone else be part of the arithmetic? She thought about the $60 and the borrowed dress and the arithmetic of staying afloat and the specific, exhausting loneliness of being a woman who had been managing everything alone since she was 12 years old and had gotten so good at it that the management had become invisible to her, woven into the fabric of how she moved through the world. She thought about 3 weeks of being seen, not observed, seen the way Dmitri saw things, with the complete attention of a man who took nothing for granted and cataloged everything that mattered. She thought about the word Dmitri, which she had saved and saved, held on her tongue through the warehouse, ready to detonate. I'm staying, she said. Not because of the contract, not because of the money. She held his gaze. Because you looked at me in a restaurant 3 weeks ago and decided I was worth paying attention to. And I have been waiting my entire life for someone to do that without wanting something back for it. She paused. And because I think you actually need someone to be honest with you more than you need almost anything else. And I'm apparently very good at that. The corner of his mouth moved, not the not-quite smile. The actual thing, brief and real, and slightly crooked from the old break in his jaw, and Emma looked at it and thought, that's the first time I've seen that, and filed it. The contract, he said. Burn it, Emma said. They burned it in this fireplace. Not that night. 3 days later, when the immediate logistics of the new piece had been established and Emma's mother had been returned to the facility in Evanston with the kind of security presence that made the facility director visibly nervous, until Dmitri had a 40-minute phone conversation that resolved the nervousness without Emma ever learning its contents. 3 days of the building settling back into its routines, of Roman's absence creating a specific silence in the operational structure that Dmitri was already beginning to fill with different people in different configurations. 3 days of mornings at the kitchen table and evenings that were longer than they needed to be, and conversations that moved past strategy and into the territory of things that actually mattered. On the third evening, Emma found the document in Dmitri's study. The original contract, printed and signed in the first 48 hours of the arrangement. The number on the first page that had been more than 6 years of lunch shifts. She brought it to the main room where he was reading and held it out. He looked at it, then at her. Now? He said. Now, she said. They stood at the fireplace and he put the contract in, and they watched it catch. The paper going first at the edges, curling inward, the signatures disappearing into heat, the terms and the conditions and the financial architecture of a transaction that had stopped being a transaction somewhere around day 4, dissolving into light and ash. Emma watched it burn. She thought about the Christmas Eve restaurant with its crystal chandeliers, and the water she'd been drinking that she couldn't afford, and the check on the table, and the silence that had preceded his voice. She thought about the city below them, still there, still the same indifferent and beautiful machine it had always been, and the fact that she was looking at it from a different altitude now, not just geographically. She thought about what her mother had said at the facility when Emma had come to explain, finally, the full version of the past month. Her mother had listened with the sharpened attention Emma remembered from before the difficult years, and when Emma finished, her mother had said, "He sounds like someone who got very good at surviving and forgot to make room for anything else. Like someone else I know." And Emma had not been able to argue with that. The contract finished burning. Dmitri looked at the fireplace for a moment. Then he looked at her and Emma looked back at him, and the thing between them was not the arrangement or the strategy or the performance of anything. It was just the two of them, standing in a room in Chicago in the middle of winter, having survived something together and come out the other side changed in ways they were still mapping. "I have one more condition," Emma said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "My program," she said. "When I finish it, the hospitality management degree, I want to use it, actually use it. I've been thinking about the legitimate side of your operation, the restaurant holdings, the hotel property on Michigan Avenue that Roman was mismanaging." She looked at him steadily. "I want to run it, not consult. Run it." Dmitri looked at her. "You want to manage my legitimate hospitality portfolio," he said. "I want to build it into something that actually functions," Emma said, "which it currently doesn't. I've been looking at the numbers for 2 weeks. You've been looking at my financial records for 2 weeks. Marcus gave me access when I asked. He seems to have decided I'm trustworthy." She held his gaze. "Was he wrong?" The silence was 3 seconds. "No," Dmitri said. "He was not wrong." Something moved in his face. Not the smile, something deeper. The look of a man who is still in the process of understanding that he has found someone he did not know he was looking for. "The Michigan Avenue property is yours." "I don't need it given to me," Emma said. "I'll earn it." "I know you will," he said. "That's why I'm giving you the starting position instead of making you work for 5 years to get it." He looked at her. "That's not charity. That's resource allocation." Emma almost smiled. "Resource allocation?" she said. "You're the best operational thinker I've encountered in 15 years of running this organization," he said. It was the same flat, direct tone he used for weather reports and strategic assessments. "Putting you in a junior role for 5 years would be like using a precision instrument to open envelopes." Emma looked at him. She thought about every restaurant kitchen she'd walked into at 19 and the head chef who'd looked at her like furniture in the wrong room, and she thought about the 2 weeks of returning until he stopped looking at her like that, and she thought about what it felt like to have someone skip the 2 weeks entirely and simply see the thing that was already there. "Agreed," she said. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did. Gradually, then suddenly, the city shedding its winter gray in increments until one morning you looked out the window and the lake was blue instead of pewter, and the trees along the lakefront had produced their annual impossible green. Emma finished her program in April. The ceremony was small. It was a night program, attended by people who had jobs and obligations and were finishing something they'd started between the other demands of their lives, and there was no grand tradition to it, just folding chairs in an auditorium and names read off a list and a piece of paper that represented 3 years of work. Emma's mother was there, 8 months further into her recovery than she'd been in January, clearer and more present than Emma had seen her in years. Dmitri sat beside her in a charcoal suit. Not the same one, but the same quality of it, the same effortless correctness of a man who wore good things without performing them. And he shook hands with Emma's mother afterward with the specific formality of a man who was being careful to earn something rather than assuming it. And Emma watched her mother assess him with the judicial expression she'd been wearing since arriving in the penthouse on the night of the warehouse, and saw something in her mother's face that was the closest thing to approval she was going to give anyone on a first assessment. It was enough. The Michigan Avenue property took Emma 4 months to restructure. She hired 3 people, 1 from the program, 2 from her years in the industry, and she rebuilt the operations from the ground up with the methodical, relentless precision of someone who had been doing this kind of arithmetic her entire life, and was finally doing it in a context where it could become something real. Dmitri looked at the quarterly numbers in August and said nothing, which she had learned was his version of exceptional praise, and she told him so, and he looked at her with something that had graduated well past the not-quite smile into something that was simply his face when he was in the presence of the one thing that had become, without planning for it, essential. They did not have a second wedding. The license they'd signed in the first week of the arrangement was legally sufficient. Emma kept her name, Clark, not Volkov, a decision Dmitri had accepted without discussion, and which she suspected he had expected. She was Emma Clark in her professional life and Emma Volkov in the world he moved through, and she had made a kind of peace with both, the way you make peace with things that are complex but true. Roman was dealt with in ways Emma was not told and did not ask about, which was a line she had drawn deliberately. There were parts of this world she moved around the edges of without entering, and that was one of them. What she knew was that it was handled. What she felt about that was complicated, and she carried the complication without resolving it, because some things did not resolve, and the pretense that they did was its own kind of dishonesty. Kozlov held the Monroe line. It held through summer and into fall, through two smaller incidents that were managed without escalation, through Petrov's quiet expansion of his northern operations that technically violated the spirit of the agreement while respecting its letter, which was the kind of thing that powerful men did and which required constant renegotiation. Emma was not part of those negotiations and did not try to be. She had found her territory in this world, and it was specific and bounded and hers. The night she understood what her life had become was an ordinary one, October. The lake outside the penthouse windows was the dark pewter of a late-season evening, the city lights beginning to come on in their familiar pattern. Emma was at the kitchen table with a quarterly report from the Michigan Avenue property and a cup of coffee going cold beside her hand, and Dmitri was in the chair across from her reading something she hadn't asked about. And the penthouse was quiet in the specific inhabited way of a space that has been lived in long enough to have its own character. He reached over without looking up from what he was reading and moved her coffee cup 3 inches toward her hand. A small motion. Automatic. The kind of gesture a person makes when they've learned the territory of another person's habits well enough that accommodation becomes reflex. Emma looked at the cup. She looked at his hand, back on the table, on his own side of it. She picked up the coffee and drank it and looked at her quarterly report and thought about Christmas Eve and borrowed dresses and $60 and what the arithmetic of staying afloat looked like from the other side of having survived it. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is real. Not the fairy tale version, not the smooth, idealized, consequence-free version where love arrived without cost and changed everything without changing you. The real version, which was harder and truer, and which had been built from grief and strategy and betrayal, and burned contracts and warehouse floors, and a word held on a tongue like a detonator, and a mother in a facility in Evanston growing tomatoes in a raised bed. The real version, which asked something of you and gave something back in proportion. Dmitri looked up from what he was reading. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, completely, without searching for it, his gaze finding her face with the ease of something practiced, until it became instinct. In the lamplight of the kitchen, the scar along his jaw cast a slight shadow, and his pale eyes were the color of the lake in winter, and Emma Clark, who had been invisible for most of her life, looked back at him and thought, this is the person who decided I was worth seeing. And I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure he knows what that meant. What? He said. Nothing, she said. Working. He looked at her for one more second, that complete, unhurried attention, and went back to his reading. Emma turned a page in the quarterly report. Outside the penthouse windows, the city of Chicago burned with its 10,000 ordinary lights, indifferent and beautiful and enormous, going about the infinite business of being a city where things happened every night that no one recorded and no one would remember, except the people to whom they had mattered. This had mattered, not because it was extraordinary, though it was, and not because it had ended well, though it had, at a cost, in the way that real things ended, but because two broken and careful people had found each other in the middle of something that was supposed to be a transaction and had discovered, somewhere in the arithmetic of surviving it together, that they were building something neither of them had known how to ask for. That was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was the kind of thing you didn't get by wishing for it. You got it by shaking a hand in the dark and staying.